The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. Read by Lalla Ward. As you are listening to these words, you are taking part in one of the wonders of the natural world. For you and I belong to a species with a remarkable ability. We can shape events in each other's brains with exquisite precision. That ability is language. Simply by making noises with our mouths, we can reliably cause precise new combinations of ideas to arise in each other's minds. The ability comes so naturally that we are apt to forget what a miracle it is. So let me remind you with some simple demonstrations. Asking you only to surrender your imagination to my words for a few moments, I can cause you to think some very specific thoughts. When a male octopus spots a female, his normally greyish body suddenly becomes striped. He swims above the female and begins caressing her with 7 of his arms. If she allows this, he will quickly reach toward her and slip his 8th arm into her breathing tube. A series of sperm packets move slowly through a groove in his arm, finally to slip into the mantle cavity of the female. Wine on a tablecloth? Apply club soda immediately. It works beautifully to remove the stains from fabrics. When Dixie opens the door to Tad, she is stunned because she thought he was dead. She slams it in his face and then tries to escape. However, when Tad says, "I love you," she lets him in. Tad comforts her and they become passionate. When Brian interrupts, Dixie tells a stunned Tad that she and Brian were married earlier that day. With much difficulty, Dixie informs Brian that things are nowhere near finished between her and Tad. Then she spills the news that Jamie is Tad's son. "My what?" says a shocked Tad. Think about what these words have done. I did not simply remind you of octopuses. In the unlikely event that you ever see one develop stripes, you now know what will happen next. Perhaps the next time you're in a supermarket, you will look for club soda, one out of the tens of thousands of items available, and then not touch it until months later when a particular substance and a particular object accidentally come together. You now share with millions of other people the secrets of protagonists in a world that is the product of some stranger's imagination, the daytime drama, All My Children. True, my demonstrations depended on our ability to read and write, and this makes our communication even more impressive by bridging gaps of time, space, and acquaintanceship. But writing is clearly an optional accessory. The real engine of verbal communication is the spoken language we acquired as children. In any natural history of the human species, language would stand out as the preeminent trait. To be sure, a solitary human is an impressive problem solver and engineer, but a race of Robinson Crusoes would not give an extraterrestrial observer all that much to remark on. What is truly arresting about our kind is better captured in the story of the Tower of Babel, in which humanity, speaking a single language, came so close to reaching heaven that God himself felt threatened. A common language connects the members of a community into an information-sharing network with formidable collective powers. Anyone can benefit from the strokes of genius and trial-and-error wisdom accumulated by anyone else, present or past. And people can work in teams, their efforts coordinated by negotiated agreements. Language is so tightly woven into human experience that it is scarcely possible to imagine life without it. Chances are that if you find 2 or more people together anywhere on Earth, they will soon be exchanging words. When there is no one else, people talk to themselves, to their dogs, even to their plants. This book is about human language. Unlike most books with language in the title, it will not chide you about proper usage, trace the origins of idioms and slang, or divert you with palindromes, anagrams, eponyms, or those precious names for groups of animals like exaltation of larks. For I will be writing not about the English language or any other language, but about something much more basic. The instinct to learn, speak, and understand language. For the first time in history, there is something to write about it. Some 35 years ago, a new science was born. Now called cognitive science, it combines tools from psychology, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and neurobiology to explain the workings of human intelligence. The science of language, in particular, has seen spectacular advances, and I hope to communicate these exciting discoveries. But I have another agenda as well. The recent illumination of linguistic abilities has revolutionary implications for our understanding of language and its role in human affairs, and for our view of humanity itself. Most educated people have opinions about language. They know that it is man's most important cultural invention, the quintessential example of his capacity to use symbols, and a biologically unprecedented event irrevocably separating him from other animals. They know that language pervades thought, with different languages causing their speakers to construe reality in different ways. They know that children learn to talk from role models and caregivers. They know that grammatical sophistication used to be nurtured in the schools, but sagging educational standards and the debasements of popular culture have led to a frightening decline in the ability of the average person to construct a grammatical sentence. They also know that English is a zany, logic-defying tongue, in which one drives on a parkway and parks in a driveway, plays at a recital and recites at a play. They know that English spelling takes such wackiness to even greater heights. Wrong. Every one of these common opinions is wrong. And they are all wrong for a single reason. Language is not a cultural artifact that we learn the way we learn to tell time or how the government works. Instead, it is a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains. Language is a complex, specialized skill which develops in the child spontaneously, without conscious effort or formal instruction, is deployed without awareness of its underlying logic, is qualitatively the same in every individual, and is distinct from more general abilities to process information or behave intelligently. For these reasons, some cognitive scientists have described language as a psychological faculty, a mental organ, a neural system, and a computational module. But I prefer the admittedly quaint term instinct. It conveys the idea that people know how to talk, in more or less the sense that spiders know how to spin webs. The complexity of language from the scientist's point of view is part of our biological birthright. It's not something that parents teach their children, or something that must be elaborated in school. A preschooler's tacit knowledge of grammar is more sophisticated than the most state-of-the-art computer language system, and the same applies to all healthy human beings. The conception of language as a kind of instinct was first articulated in 1871 by Darwin himself. In The Descent of Man, he had to contend with language because its confinement to humans seemed to present a challenge to his theory. As in all matters, his observations are uncannily modern. As one of the founders of the noble science of philology observes, language is an art, like brewing or baking. But writing would have been a better simile. It certainly is not a true instinct, for every language has to be learned. It differs, however, widely from all ordinary arts, for man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, while no child has an instinctive tendency to brew, bake, or write. Moreover, no philologist now supposes that any language has been deliberately invented. It has been slowly and unconsciously developed by many steps. Darwin concluded that language ability is an instinctive tendency to acquire an art. Watch an immigrant struggling with a second language, or a stroke patient with a first one, or deconstruct a snatch of baby talk, or try to program a computer to understand English, and ordinary speech begins to look different. The effortlessness, the transparency, the automaticity are illusions, masking a system of great richness and beauty. In the 20th century, the most famous argument that language is like an instinct comes from Noam Chomsky, the linguist who first unmasked the intricacy of the system, and perhaps the person most responsible for the modern revolution in language and cognitive science. Chomsky called attention to two fundamental facts about language. First, virtually every sentence that a person utters or understands is a brand new combination of words appearing for the first time in the history of the universe. Therefore, a language cannot be a repertoire of responses. The brain must contain a recipe or program that can build an unlimited set of sentences out of a finite list of words. That program may be called a mental grammar, not to be confused with pedagogical or stylistic grammars, which are just guides to the etiquette of written prose. The second fundamental fact is that children develop these complex grammars rapidly and without formal instruction, and grow up to give consistent interpretations to novel sentence constructions that they have never before encountered. Therefore, he argued, children must innately be equipped with a plan common to the grammars of all languages, a universal grammar that tells them how to distill the syntactic patterns out of the speech of their parents. Chomsky gets people exercised. Reactions range from awestruck deference to the withering invective that academics have developed into a high art. In part, this is because Chomsky attacks what is still one of the foundations of 20th century intellectual life, the standard social science model, according to which the human psyche is moulded by the surrounding culture. The story I will tell has, of course, been deeply influenced by Chomsky. But it is not his story exactly. I think it is fruitful to consider language as an evolutionary adaptation, like the eye, its major parts designed to carry out important functions. And the best place to begin this story is to ask why. Why should anyone believe that human language is a part of human biology, an instinct, at all? By the 1920s, it was thought that no corner of the earth fit for human habitation had remained unexplored. New Guinea, the world's second largest island, was no exception. The European missionaries, planters and administrators clung to its coastal lowlands, convinced that no one could live in the treacherous mountain range that ran in a solid line down the middle of the island. But the mountains visible from each coast in fact belonged to two ranges, not one, and between them was a temperate plateau crossed by many fertile valleys. 1 million Stone Age people lived in those highlands, isolated from the rest of the world for 40,000 years. The veil would not be lifted until gold was discovered in a tributary of one of the main rivers. The ensuing gold rush attracted Michael Leahy, a footloose Australian prospector, who on the 26th of May 1930 set out to explore the mountains with a fellow prospector and a group of indigenous lowland people hired as carriers. After scaling the heights, Leahy was amazed to see grassy, open country on the other side. The next day they made their first contact with the Highlanders, and the astonishment was mutual. Leahy wrote in his diary, "We could see that they were utterly thunderstruck by our appearance. When I took off my hat, those nearest to me backed away in terror. One old chap came forward gingerly with open mouth and touched me to see if I was real. Then he knelt down and rubbed his hands over my bare legs, possibly to find out if they were painted, and grabbed me around the knees and hugged them, rubbing his bushy head against me. The women and children gradually got up courage to approach also, and presently the camp was swarming with a lot of them, all running about and jabbering at once, pointing to everything that was new to them." That jabbering was language, an unfamiliar language, one of 800 different ones that would be discovered among the isolated Highlanders right up through the 1960s. Leahy's first contact repeated a scene that must have taken place hundreds of times in human history whenever one people first encountered another. All of them, as far as we know, already had language. No mute tribe has ever been discovered. As in every other case, the language spoken by Leahy's hosts turned out to be no mere jabber, but a medium that could express abstract concepts, invisible entities, and complex trains of reasoning. The universality of complex language is a discovery that fills linguists with awe, and is the first reason to suspect that language is not just any cultural invention, but the product of a special human instinct. Cultural inventions vary widely in their sophistication from society to society. Within a society, the inventions are generally at the same level of sophistication. Some groups count by carving notches on bones and cook on fires ignited by spinning sticks in logs. Others use computers and microwave ovens. Language, however, ruins this correlation. There are Stone Age societies, but there is no such thing as a Stone Age language. The anthropological linguist Edward Sapir wrote, "When it comes to linguistic form, Plato walks with the Macedonian swineherd, Confucius with the head-hunting savage of Assam." To pick an example at random of a sophisticated linguistic form in a non-industrialized people, the linguist Joan Bresnan recently wrote a technical article comparing a construction in Kivunjo, a Bantu language spoken in several villages on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, with its counterpart construction in English, which she describes as a West Germanic language spoken in England and its former colonies. The English construction is called the dative and is found in sentences like, "She baked me a brownie," and "He promised her arpège," where an indirect object like me or her is placed after the verb to indicate the beneficiary of an act. The corresponding Kivunjo construction is called the applicative, whose resemblance to the English dative, Bresnan notes, can be likened to that of the game of chess to checkers. The Kivunjo construction fits entirely inside the verb, which has 7 prefixes and suffixes, 2 moods, and 14 tenses. The verb agrees with its subject, its object, and its benefactive nouns, each of which comes in 16 genders. In case you're wondering, these genders do not pertain to things like transsexuals. To a linguist, the term gender retains its original meaning of kind, as in the related words generic and genus. The Bantu genders refer to kinds like humans, animals, extended objects, and clusters of objects. Actually, the people whose linguistic abilities are most badly underestimated are right here in our society. Linguists repeatedly run up against the myth that working-class people and the less educated members of the middle class speak a simpler or coarser language. This is a pernicious illusion arising from the effortlessness of conversation. Ordinary speech, like colour vision or walking, is a paradigm of engineering excellence, a technology that works so well that the user takes its outcome for granted, unaware of the complicated machinery hidden behind the panels. Behind such simple sentences as, "Where did he go?" and "The guy I met killed himself," used automatically by any English speaker, are dozens of subroutines that arrange the words to express the meaning. Despite decades of effort, no artificially engineered language system comes close to duplicating the person in the street. But though the language engine is invisible to the human user, its trim is attended to obsessively. Trifling differences between the dialect of the mainstream and the dialect of other groups like isn't any versus ain't no, those books versus them books, and dragged him away versus drug him away, are dignified as badges of proper grammar. But they have no more to do with grammatical sophistication than the fact that English speakers call canines dogs, whereas French speakers call them chiens. It is even a bit misleading to call Standard English a language and variations dialects, as if there were some meaningful difference between them. The best definition comes from the linguist Max Weinreich. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. The myth that non-standard dialects of English are grammatically deficient is widespread. In the 1960s, some well-meaning educational psychologists announced that American black children had been so culturally deprived that they lacked true language and were confined instead to a non-logical mode of expressive behavior. conclusions were based on the students' shy or sullen reactions to batteries of standardized tests. If the psychologists had listened to spontaneous conversations, they would have rediscovered the commonplace fact that American black culture is everywhere highly verbal. The subculture of street youths in particular is famous in the annals of anthropology for the value placed on linguistic virtuosity. Here is an example from an interview conducted by the linguist William Leboff on a stoop in Harlem. The interviewee is Larry, the roughest member of a teenage gang called the Jets.
You know, like some people say, if you're good and shit, your spirit going to heaven. You're good, if you're bad, your spirit going to hell. But bullshit, your spirit going to hell anyway, good or bad, you know? Why? Why? I'll tell you why. Because you see, doesn't nobody really know that it's a God, you know? Because I mean, I have seen black gods, pink gods, white gods, all color gods. And don't nobody know it's really a God. And when they be saying if you're good, you going to heaven, that's bullshit. Because you ain't going to no heaven. Because it ain't no heaven for you to go to.
Well, just suppose there's a God.
Mm-hmm.
Would he be white or black?
He'd be white, man.
Why?
Why? I'll tell you why. Because the average whitey out here got everything. You dig? And a nigga ain't got shit, you know? You understand? So for that to happen, you know it ain't no black God that's doing that bullshit.
First contact with Larry's grammar may produce negative reactions, but to a linguist, it punctiliously conforms to the rules of the dialect called Black English Vernacular, BEV. The most linguistically interesting thing about the dialect is how linguistically uninteresting it is. If Leboff did not have to call attention to it to debunk the claim that ghetto children lack true linguistic competence, it would have been filed away as just another language. Where Standard American English, SAE, uses their, THERE, as a meaningless dummy subject for the copula, BEV uses it as a meaningless dummy subject for the copula. Copula is the verb to be when it is used to link a subject and a predicate. So compare SAE's "there's really a God" with Larry's "it's really a God." Larry's negative concord, "you ain't going to no heaven," is seen in many languages, such as French, ne ... pas. Like speakers of SAE, Larry inverts subjects and auxiliaries in non-declarative sentences, but the exact set of the sentence types allowing inversion differs slightly. Larry and other BEV speakers invert subjects and auxiliaries in negative main clauses like "don't nobody know." SAE speakers invert them only in questions like "doesn't anybody know?" and a few other sentence types. BEV allows its speakers the option of deleting copulas, "if you bad." This is not random laziness, but a systematic rule that is virtually identical to the contraction rule in SAE that reduces "he is" to "he's," "you are" to "you're," and "I am" to "I'm." In both dialects, B can erode only in certain kinds of sentences. No SAE speaker would try the following contractions. "Yes, he is" to "yes, he's." "Who is it" to "who's it." For the same reasons, no BEV speaker would try the following deletions. "Yes, he is" "yes, he." "Who is it" "who it." Note, too, that BEV speakers are not just more prone to eroding words. BEV speakers use the full forms of certain auxiliaries, "I have seen," whereas SAE speakers usually contract them, "I've seen." And as we would expect from comparisons between languages, there are areas in which BEV is more precise than Standard English. He be working means that he generally works, perhaps that he has a regular job. He working means only that he is working at the moment that the sentence is uttered. In SAE, he is working fails to make that distinction. Moreover, sentences like, in order for that to happen, you know it ain't no black god that's doing that bullshit, show that Larry's speech uses the full inventory of grammatical paraphernalia that computer scientists struggle unsuccessfully to duplicate. Relative clauses, complement structures, clause subordination, and so on. Another project of Leibov's involved tabulating the percentage of grammatical sentences in tape recordings of speech in a variety of social classes and social settings. Grammatical, for these purposes, means well formed according to consistent rules in the dialect of the speakers. For example, if a speaker asked the question, "Where are you going?" the respondent would not be penalized for answering, "To the store," even though it is in some sense not a complete sentence. Such ellipses are obviously part of the grammar of conversational English. The alternative, "I am going to the store," sounds stilted and is almost never used. Ungrammatical sentences, by this definition, include randomly broken-off sentence fragments, tongue-tied hemming and hawing, slips of the tongue, and other forms of word salad. The results of Leibov's tabulation are enlightening. The great majority of sentences were grammatical, especially in casual speech, with higher percentages of grammatical sentences in working-class speech than in middle-class speech. The highest percentage of ungrammatical sentences was found in the proceedings of learned academic conferences. The ubiquity of complex language among human beings is a gripping discovery, and for many observers, compelling proof that language is innate. But to tough-minded skeptics like the philosopher Hilary Putnam, it is no proof at all. Not everything that is universal is innate, Coca-Cola and Bart Simpson t-shirts being examples. Universal grammar could simply reflect the universal exigencies of human experience and the universal limitations on human information processing. All languages have words for water and foot because all people need to refer to water and feet. No language has a word 1,000,000 syllables long because no person would have time to say it. So the universality of language does not lead to an innate language instinct as night follows day. To convince you that there is a language instinct, I will have to fill in an argument that leads from the jabbering of modern peoples to the putative genes for grammar. The crucial intervening steps come from my own professional speciality, the study of language development in children. The crux of the argument is that complex language is universal because children actually reinvent it, generation after generation, not because they are taught, not because they're generally smart, not because it's useful to them, but because they just can't help it. Let me now take you down this trail of evidence. The trail begins with the study of how the particular languages we find in the world today arose. Here, one would think, linguistics runs into the problem of any historical science. No one recorded the crucial events at the time they happened. But we need to see how people create a complex language from scratch. Amazingly, we can. The first cases were wrung from two of the more sorrowful episodes of world history, the Atlantic slave trade and indentured servitude in the South Pacific, where slaves and laborers from different language backgrounds were mixed on the cotton, coffee, and sugar plantations. When speakers of different languages have to communicate to carry out practical tasks, but do not have the opportunity to learn one another's languages, they develop a makeshift jargon called a pidgin. Pidgins are choppy strings of words borrowed from the language of the colonizers or plantation owners, highly variable in order, and with little in the way of grammar. Sometimes a pidgin can become a lingua franca, and gradually increase in complexity over decades, as in the pidgin English of the modern South Pacific. But the linguist Derek Bickerton has presented evidence that in many cases, a pidgin can be transmuted into a full, complex language in one fell swoop. All it takes is for a group of children to be exposed to the pidgin at the age when they acquire their mother tongue. That happened, Bickerton has argued, when children were isolated from their parents and were tended collectively by a worker who spoke to them in the pidgin. Not content to reproduce the fragmentary word strings, the children injected grammatical complexity where none existed before, resulting in a brand new, richly expressive language. The language that results when children make a pidgin their native tongue is called a Creole. Bickerton's main evidence comes from a unique historical circumstance. Though the slave plantations that spawned most Creoles are a thing of the remote past, one episode of creolization occurred recently enough for us to study its principal players. Just before the turn of the 20th century, there was a boom in Hawaiian sugar plantations, whose demands for labor quickly outstripped the native pool. Workers were brought in from China, Japan, Korea, Portugal, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, and a pidgin quickly developed. Many of the immigrant laborers who first developed that pidgin were alive when Bickerton interviewed them in the 1970s. Here is a typical example of their speech. Me cape buy, me check make. The speaker, a 92-year-old Japanese immigrant talking about his earlier days as a coffee farmer, was trying to say, "He bought my coffee. He made me out a check." But the utterance itself could just as easily have meant, "I bought coffee. I made him out a check." The pidgin did not offer the speaker the ordinary grammatical resources to convey this message. No consistent word order, no prefixes or suffixes, no tense or other temporal and logical markers, no structure more complex than a simple clause, and no consistent way to indicate who did what to whom. But the children who'd grown up in Hawaii, beginning in the 1890s, and who were exposed to the pidgin, ended up speaking quite differently. Here are two sentences from the language they invented, Hawaiian Creole, both from Japanese Hawaiians born on the islands. "Da fierce Japani came ran away from Japan come." The first Japanese who arrived ran away from Japan to here. "One time when we go home in a night, this thing stay fly up." Once when we went home at night, this thing was flying about. Do not be misled by what look like crudely placed English verbs such as go, stay, and came, or phrases like one time. They are not haphazard uses of English words, but systematic uses of Hawaiian Creole grammar. The words have been converted by the Creole speakers into auxiliaries, prepositions, case markers, and relative pronouns. In fact, this is probably how many of the grammatical prefixes and suffixes in established languages arose. For example, the English past tense ending ed may have evolved from the verb do. He hammered was originally something like he hammer did. Indeed, Creoles are bona fide languages with standardized word orders and grammatical markers that were lacking in the pidgin of the immigrants, and aside from the sounds of words, not taken from the language of the colonizers. Bickerton notes that if the grammar of a Creole is largely the product of the minds of children, unadulterated by complex language input from their parents, it should provide a particularly clear window on the innate grammatical machinery of the brain. He argues that Creoles from unrelated language mixtures exhibit uncanny resemblances, perhaps even the same basic grammar. This basic grammar also shows up, he suggests, in the errors children make when acquiring more established and embellished languages, like some underlying design bleeding through a veneer of whitewash. When English-speaking children say, "Why he is leaving? Nobody don't likes me. I'm gonna full Angela's bucket." They are unwittingly producing sentences that are grammatical in many of the world's creoles. Bickerton's basic idea has been stunningly corroborated by 2 recent natural experiments in which creolization by children can be observed in real time. These fascinating discoveries are among many that have come from the study of the sign languages of the deaf. Contrary to popular misconceptions, sign languages are not pantomimes and gestures, inventions of educators, or ciphers of the spoken language of the surrounding community. They are found wherever there is a community of deaf people, and each one is a distinct full language using the same kinds of grammatical machinery found worldwide in spoken languages. For example, American Sign Language, used by the deaf community in the United States, does not resemble English or British Sign Language, but relies on agreement and gender systems in a way that is reminiscent of Navajo and Bantu. Until recently, there were no sign languages at all in Nicaragua, because its deaf people remained isolated from one another. When the Sandinista government took over in 1979 and reformed the educational system, the first schools for the deaf were created. The schools focused on drilling the children in lip reading and speech, and, as in every case where that is tried, the results were dismal. But it did not matter. On the playgrounds and school buses, the children were inventing their own sign system, pooling the makeshift gestures that they used with their families at home. Before long, the system congealed into what is now called the Lenguaje de Signos Nicaragüense, LSN. Today, LSN is used with varying degrees of fluency by young deaf adults, aged 17 to 25, who developed it when they were 10 or older. Basically, it is a pidgin. Everyone uses it differently, and the signers depend on suggestive, elaborate circumlocutions rather than on a consistent grammar. But children like Mayela, who joined the school around the age of 4 when LSN was already around, and all the pupils younger than her, are quite different. Their signing is more fluid and compact, and the gestures are more stylized and less like a pantomime. In fact, when their signing is examined close up, it is so different from LSN that it's referred to by a different name, Idioma de Signos Nicaragüense, ISN. LSN and ISN are currently being studied by the psycholinguists Judy Cagle, Miriam Hebe Lopez, and Annie Sengas. ISN appears to be a creole, created in one leap when the younger children were exposed to the pidgin signing of the older children, just as Bickerton would have predicted. ISN has spontaneously standardized itself. All the young children sign it in the same way. The children have introduced many grammatical devices that were absent in LSN, and hence they rely far less on circumlocutions. For example, an LSN, pidgin signer, might make the sign for talk to, and then point from the position of the talker to the position of the hearer. But an ISN, creole signer, modifies the sign itself, sweeping it in one motion from a point representing the talker to a point representing the hearer. This is a common device in sign languages, formally identical to inflecting a verb for agreement in spoken languages. Thanks to such consistent grammar, ISN is very expressive. A child can watch a surrealistic cartoon and describe its plot to another child. The children use it in jokes, poems, narratives, and life histories. And it's coming to serve as the glue that holds the community together. A language has been born before our eyes. But ISN was the collective product of many children communicating with one another. If we are to attribute the richness of language to the mind of the child, we really want to see a single child adding some increment of grammatical complexity to the input the child has received. Once again, the study of the deaf grants our wish. When deaf infants are raised by signing parents, They learn sign language in the same way that hearing infants learn spoken language. But deaf children who are not born to deaf parents, the majority of deaf children, often have no access to sign language users as they grow up, and indeed are sometimes deliberately kept from them by educators in the oralist tradition who want to force them to master lip reading and speech. When deaf children become adults, they tend to seek out deaf communities and begin to acquire the sign language that takes proper advantage of the communicative media available to them. But by then, it is usually too late. They must then struggle with sign language as a difficult intellectual puzzle, much as a hearing adult does in foreign language classes. Their proficiency is notably below that of deaf people who acquired sign language as infants, just as adult immigrants are often permanently burdened with accents and conspicuous grammatical errors. Indeed, because the deaf are virtually the only neurologically normal people who make it to adulthood without having acquired a language, their difficulties offer particularly good evidence that successful language acquisition must take place during a critical window of opportunity in childhood. The psycholinguists Jenny Singleton and Alyssa Newport have studied a 9-year-old, profoundly deaf boy to whom they gave the pseudonym Simon, and his parents, who are also deaf. Simon's parents did not acquire sign language until the late ages of 15 and 16, and, as a result, they acquired it badly. In ASL, as in many languages, one can move a phrase to the front of a sentence and mark it with a prefix or suffix, in ASL, raised eyebrows and a lifted chin, to indicate that it is the topic of the sentence. The English sentence, "Elvis I really like," is a rough equivalent. But Simon's parents rarely used this construction and mangled it when they did. For example, Simon's father once tried to sign the thought, "My friend, he thought my second child was deaf." It came out as, "My friend thought my second child, he thought he was deaf." A bit of sign salad that violates not only ASL grammar, but, according to Chomsky's theory, the universal grammar that governs all naturally acquired human languages. Simon's parents had also failed to grasp the verb inflection system of ASL. In ASL, the verb to blow is signed by opening a fist held horizontally in front of the mouth, like a puff of air. Any verb in ASL can be modified to indicate that the action is being done continuously. The signer superimposes an arc-like motion on the sign and repeats it quickly. A verb can also be modified to indicate that the action is being done to more than one object, for example, several candles. The signer terminates the sign in one location in space, then repeats it, but terminates it at another location. These inflections can be combined in either of two orders. Blow, toward the left and then toward the right and repeat, or blow, toward the left twice and then blow toward the right twice. The first order means to blow out the candles on one cake, then another cake, then the first cake again, then the second cake again. The second means to blow out the candles on one cake continuously and then blow out the candles on another cake continuously. This elegant set of rules was lost on Simon's parents. They used the inflections inconsistently and never combined them onto a verb two at a time, though they would occasionally use the inflections separately, crudely linked with signs like then. In many ways, Simon's parents were like pidgin speakers. Astoundingly, though Simon saw no ASL but his parents' defective version, his own signing was far better ASL than theirs. He understood sentences with moved topic phrases without difficulty. And when he had to describe complex videotaped events, he used the ASL verb inflections almost perfectly, even in sentences requiring two of them in particular orders. Simon must somehow have shut out his parents' ungrammatical noise. He must have latched on to the inflections that his parents used inconsistently and reinterpreted them as mandatory. and he must have seen the logic that was implicit, though never realized, in his parents' use of two kinds of verb inflection, and reinvented the ASL system of superimposing both of them onto a single verb in a specific order. Simon's superiority to his parents is an example of creolization by a single living child. Actually, Simon's achievements are remarkable only because he's the first one who showed them to a psycholinguist. There must be thousands of Simons. 90 to 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. Children fortunate enough to be exposed to ASL at all often get it from hearing parents who themselves learned it, incompletely, to communicate with their children. Indeed, as the transition from LSN to ISN shows, sign languages themselves are surely products of creolization. Educators at various points in history have tried to invent sign systems, sometimes based on the surrounding spoken language. But these crude codes are always unlearnable, and when deaf children learn from them at all, they do so by converting them into much richer natural languages. Extraordinary acts of creation by children do not require the extraordinary circumstances of deafness or plantation babels. The same kind of linguistic genius is involved every time a child learns his or her mother tongue. First, let us do away with the folklore that parents teach their children language. No one supposes that parents provide explicit grammar lessons, of course, but many parents, and some child psychologists who should know better, think that mothers provide children with implicit lessons. These lessons take the form of a special speech variety called motherese, intensive sessions of conversational give and take with repetitive drills and simplified grammar. Look at the doggy. See the doggy? There's a doggy. In contemporary middle-class American culture, parenting is seen as an awesome responsibility, an unforgiving vigil to keep the helpless infant from falling behind in the great race of life. One gets some perspective by examining the folly theories about parenting in other cultures. The Kung San of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa believe that children must be drilled to sit, stand, and walk. They carefully pile sand around their infants to prop them upright, and, sure enough, every one of these infants soon sits up on its own. We find this amusing because we have observed the results of the experiment that the San are unwilling to chance. We don't teach our children to sit, stand, and walk, and they do it anyway, on their own schedule. But other groups enjoy the same condescension towards us. In many communities of the world, parents do not indulge their children in motherese. In fact, they do not speak to their pre-linguistic children at all, except for occasional demands and rebukes. This is not unreasonable. After all, young children plainly can't understand a word you say, so why waste your breath in soliloquies? Any sensible person would surely wait until a child has developed speech and more gratifying two-way conversations become possible. As Aunt May, a woman living in the South Carolina Piedmont, explained to the anthropologist Shirley Bryce Heath, "Now just how crazy is dat? White folks hear their kids say something, they say it back to 'em, they ask 'em gain and gain 'bout things like they 'posed to be born knowing." Needless to say, the children in these communities, overhearing adults and other children, learn to talk, as we see in Aunt May's fully grammatical BEV. Children deserve most of the credit for the language they acquire. In fact, we can show that they know things they could not have been taught. One of Chomsky's classic illustrations of the logic of language involves the process of moving words around to form questions. Consider how you might turn the declarative sentence, "A unicorn is in the garden," into the corresponding question, "Is a unicorn in the garden?" You could scan the declarative sentence, take the auxiliary is, and move it to the front of the sentence. "A unicorn is in the garden" becomes, "Is a unicorn in the garden?" Now take the sentence, a unicorn that is eating a flower is in the garden. There are two ises. Which gets moved? Obviously not the first one hit by the scan. That would give you a very odd sentence. A unicorn that is eating a flower is in the garden becomes, is a unicorn that eating a flower is in the garden? But why can't you move that is? Where did the simple procedure go wrong? The answer, Chomsky noted, comes from the basic design of language. Though sentences are strings of words, our mental algorithms for grammar, an algorithm is an explicit, step-by-step program or set of instructions for getting the solution to some problem, do not pick out words by their linear positions, such as first word, second word, and so on. Rather, the algorithms group words into phrases, and phrases into even bigger phrases, and give each one a mental label, like subject-noun phrase, or verb phrase. The real rule for forming questions does not look for the first occurrence of the auxiliary word, as one goes from left to right in the string. It looks for the auxiliary that comes after the phrase labelled as the subject. This phrase, containing the entire string of words, a unicorn that is eating a flower, behaves as a single unit. The first is sits deeply buried in it, invisible to the question-forming rule. The second is, coming immediately after this subject-noun phrase, is the one that is moved. A unicorn that is eating a flower is in the garden becomes, is a unicorn that is eating a flower in the garden? Chomsky reasoned that if the logic of language is wired into children, then the first time they're confronted with a sentence with two auxiliaries, they should be capable of turning it into a question with the proper wording. This should be true even though the wrong rule, the one that scans the sentence as a linear string of words, is simpler and presumably easier to learn. And it should be true even though the sentences that would teach children that the linear rule is wrong and the structure-sensitive rule is right, questions with a second auxiliary embedded inside the subject phrase, are so rare as to be non-existent in motherese. Surely not every child learning English has heard mother say, "Is the doggy that is eating the flower in the garden?" For Chomsky, this kind of reasoning, which he calls the argument from the poverty of the input, is the primary justification for saying that the basic design of language is innate. Chomsky's claim that the basic design of language is innate was tested in an experiment with 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds at a daycare center by the psycholinguists Stephen Crane and Mineharu Nakayama. One of the experimenters controlled a doll of Jabba the Hutt, of Star Wars fame. The other coaxed the child to ask a set of questions by saying, for example, "Ask Jabba if the boy who is unhappy is watching Mickey Mouse." Jabba would inspect a picture and answer yes or no, but it was really the child who was being tested, not Jabba. The children cheerfully provided the appropriate questions and, as Chomsky would have predicted, not a single one of them came up with an ungrammatical string like, "Is the boy who unhappy is watching Mickey Mouse?" which the simple linear rule would have produced. Now, you may object that this does not show that children's brains register the subject of a sentence. Perhaps the children were just going by the meanings of the words. "The man who is running" refers to a single actor playing a distinct role in the picture, and children could have been keeping track of which words are about particular actors, not which words belong to the subject-noun phrase. But Crane and Nakayama anticipated the objection. Mixed into their list were commands like, "Ask Jabba if it is raining in this picture." The "it" of the sentence does not refer to anything. It is a dummy element that is there only to satisfy the rules of syntax which demand a subject. But the English question rule treats it just like any other subject. Is it raining? Now, how do children cope with this meaningless placeholder? Perhaps they are as literal-minded as the duck, in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. "I proceed," said the mouse. "Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable—" "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," the mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course you know what it means." "I know what it means well enough when I find a thing," said the duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" But children are not ducks. Crane and Nakayama's children replied, "Is it raining in this picture?" Similarly, they had no trouble forming questions with other dummy subjects, as in, "Ask Jabber if there is a snake in this picture," or with subjects that are not things, as in, "Ask Jabber if running is fun," and "Ask Jabber if love is good or bad." The universal constraints on grammatical rules also show that the basic form of language cannot be explained away as the inevitable outcome of a drive for usefulness. Many languages, widely scattered over the globe, have auxiliaries, and like English, many languages move the auxiliary to the front of the sentence to form questions and other constructions, always in a structure-dependent way. But this is not the only way one could design a question rule. One could just as effectively move the leftmost auxiliary in the string to the front, or flip the first and last words, or utter the entire sentence in mirror-reversed order. The particular ways that languages do form questions are arbitrary, species-wide conventions. We don't find them in artificial systems like computer programming languages or the notation of mathematics. The universal plan underlying languages, with auxiliaries and inversion rules, nouns and verbs, subjects and objects, phrases and clauses, case and agreement, and so on, seems to suggest a commonality in the brains of speakers, because many other plans would have been just as useful. It is as if isolated inventors miraculously came up with identical standards for typewriter keyboards or Morse code. Evidence corroborating the claim that the mind contains blueprints for grammatical rules comes once again out of the mouths of babes and sucklings. Take the English agreement suffix, s, as in he walks. Agreement is an important process in many languages, but in modern English it is superfluous, a remnant of a richer system that flourished in Old English. If it were to disappear entirely, we would not miss it any more than we miss the similar est suffix in thou sayest. But psychologically speaking, this frill does not come cheap. Any speaker committed to using it has to keep track of 4 details in every sentence uttered. 1. Whether the subject is in the third person or not. He walks versus I walk. 2. Whether the subject is singular or plural. He walks versus they walk. 3. Whether the action is present tense or not. He walks versus he walked. 4. Whether the action is habitual or going on at the moment of speaking. Its aspect. He walks to school versus he is walking to school. And all this work is needed just to use the suffix once one has learned it. To learn it in the first place, a child must 1. Notice that verbs end in s in some sentences, but appear bare-ended in others. 2. Begin a search for the grammatical causes of this variation, as opposed to just accepting it as part of the spice of life. And 3. Not rest until those crucial factors, tense, aspect, and the number and person of the subject of the sentence, have been sifted out of the ocean of conceivable but irrelevant factors, like the number of syllables of the final word in the sentence, or whether the object of a preposition is natural or man-made. Why would anyone bother? But little children do bother. By the age of 3 1/2, they use the S agreement suffix in more than 90% of the sentences that require it, and virtually never use it in the sentences that forbid it. This mastery is part of their grammar explosion, a period of several months in the third year of life during which children suddenly begin to speak in fluent sentences, respecting most of the fine points of their community's spoken language. For example, a preschooler with the pseudonym Sarah, whose parents had only a high school education, can be seen obeying the English agreement rule, useless though it is, in complex sentences like the following. Donna teases all the time and Donna has false teeth. I know what a big chicken looks like. Anybody knows how to scribble. The person takes care of the animals in the barn. Well, someone hurts itself and everything. What happens if you press on this hard? Just as interestingly, Sarah could not have been simply imitating her parents, memorizing verbs with the S's pre-attached. Sarah sometimes uttered word forms that she could not possibly have heard from her parents. When she bees in the kindergarten. He's a boy, so he gots a scary costume. She does what her mother tells her. She must then have created these forms herself, using an unconscious version of the English agreement rule. The very concept of imitation is suspect to begin with. If children are general imitators, why don't they imitate their parents' habit of sitting quietly in airplanes? But sentences like these show clearly that language acquisition cannot be explained as a kind of imitation. And when a child says, "Don't giggle me," or "We holded the baby rabbits," it cannot be by the act of imitating their mothers. One step remains to complete the argument that language is a specific instinct, not just the clever solution to a problem thought up by a generally brainy species. If language is an instinct, it should have an identifiable seat in the brain, and perhaps even a special set of genes that help wire it into place. Disrupt these genes or neurons, and language should suffer, while the other parts of intelligence carry on. Spare them in an otherwise damaged brain, and you should have a retarded individual with intact language. If, on the other hand, language is just the exercise of human smarts, we might expect that injuries and impairments would make people stupider across the board, including their language. No one has yet located a language organ or a grammar gene, but the search is on. There are several kinds of neurological and genetic impairments that compromise language while sparing cognition, and vice versa. One of them has been known for over a century. When there is damage to certain circuits in the lower parts of the frontal lobe of the brain's left hemisphere, say from a stroke or bullet wound, the person often suffers from a syndrome called Broca's aphasia. One of these victims, who eventually recovered his language ability, recalls the event which he experienced with complete lucidity. When I woke up, I had a bit of a headache, and I thought I must have been sleeping with my right arm under me, because it felt all pins and needly and numb, and I couldn't make it do what I wanted. I got out of bed, but I couldn't stand. As a matter of fact, I actually fell on the floor because my right leg was too weak to take my weight. I called out to my wife in the next room, and no sound came. I couldn't speak. I was astonished, horrified. I couldn't believe that this was happening to me, and I began to feel bewildered and frightened, and then I suddenly realized that I must have had a stroke. In a way, this rationalization made me feel somewhat relieved, but not for long, because I'd always thought the effects of a stroke were permanent in every case. I found I could speak a little, but even to me the words seemed wrong and not what I meant to say. As this writer noted, most stroke victims are not as lucky. Mr. Ford suffered a stroke at the age of 39. The neuropsychologist Howard Gardner interviewed him 3 months later. Obviously, Mr. Ford had to struggle to get speech out, but his problems were not in controlling his vocal muscles. He could blow out a candle and clear his throat, and he was as linguistically hobbled when he wrote as when he spoke. Most of his handicaps centred around grammar itself. He omitted endings like ed and s, and grammatical function words like or, be, and thee, despite their high frequency in the language. When reading aloud, he skipped over the function words. He named objects and recognised their names extremely well. He understood questions when their gist could be deduced from their content words, such as, "Does a stone float on water?" Or, "Do you use a hammer for cutting?" But not ones that required grammatical analysis like, "The lion was killed by the tiger. Which one is dead?" Despite Mr. Ford's grammatical impairment, he was clearly in command of his other faculties. Gardner notes, "He was alert, attentive, and fully aware of where he was and why he was there. Intellectual functions not closely tied to language, such as knowledge of right and left, ability to draw with the left, unpracticed hand, to calculate, read maps, set clocks, make constructions, or carry out commands, were all preserved. His intelligence quotient in non-verbal areas was in the high average range." Indeed, the dialogue shows that Mr. Ford, like many brokers aphasics, showed an acute understanding of his handicap. Injuries in adulthood are not the only ways that the circuitry underlying language can be compromised. A few otherwise healthy children just fail to develop language on schedule. When they do begin to talk, they have difficulty articulating words, and though their articulation improves with age, the victims persist in a variety of grammatical errors. When obvious non-linguistic causes are ruled out, cognitive disorders like retardation, perceptual disorders like deafness, and social disorders like autism, the children are given the accurate but not terribly helpful diagnostic label Specific Language Impairment, SLI. Language therapists, who are often called upon to treat several members in a family, have long been under the impression that SLI is hereditary. Recent statistical studies show that the impression may be correct. SLI runs in families, and if one member of a set of identical twins has it, the odds are very high that the other will too. Particularly dramatic evidence comes from one British family, the Kays, recently studied by the linguist Myrna Gopnik and several geneticists. The grandmother of the family is language impaired. She has 5 adult children. One daughter is linguistically normal, as are this daughter's children. The other 4 adults, like the grandmother, are impaired. Together, these 4 had 23 children. Of them, 11 were language impaired, 12 were normal. The language impaired children were randomly distributed among the families, the sexes, and the birth orders. Of course, the mere fact that some behavioral pattern runs in families does not show that it is genetic. Recipes, accents, and lullabies run in families, but they've nothing to do with DNA. In this case, though, a genetic cause is plausible. If the cause were in the environment, poor nutrition, hearing the defective speech of an impaired parent or sibling, watching too much TV, lead contamination from old pipes, whatever, then why would the syndrome capriciously strike some family members while leaving their near-age mates alone? In fact, the geneticists working with Gopnik noted that the pedigree suggests a trait controlled by a single dominant gene. What does this hypothetical gene do? It does not seem to impair overall intelligence. Most of the afflicted family members score in the normal range in the nonverbal parts of IQ tests. It is their language that is impaired, but they are not like Broca's aphasics. The impression is more of a tourist struggling in a foreign city. They speak somewhat slowly and deliberately, carefully planning what they will say and encouraging their interlocutors to come to their aid by completing sentences for them. They report that ordinary conversation is strenuous mental work, and that when possible they avoid situations in which they must speak. Their speech contains frequent grammatical errors, such as misuse of pronouns and of suffixes like the plural and past tense. It's a flying finches they are. She remembered when she hurts herself the other day. The neighbours phone the ambulance because the man fall off the tree. The boys eat 4 cookie. In experimental tests, they have difficulty with tasks that normal 4-year-olds breeze through. A classic example is the WUG test, another demonstration that normal children do not learn language by imitating their parents. The testee is shown a line drawing of a bird-like creature and told that it is a WUG. Then a picture of 2 of them is shown and the child is told, "Now there are 2 of them. There are 2." Your typical 4-year-old will blurt out, "WUGs!" But the language-impaired adult is stymied. One of the adults Gopnik studied laughed nervously and said, "Oh dear, well, carry on." When pressed, she responded, "Wugness, isn't it? No, I see, you want to pair it up. Okay." For the next animal, Zat, she said, Zackle. For the next, Sass, she deduced that it must be sasses. Flushed with success, she proceeded to generalize too literally, converting zoop to zoopies and tob to tobies, revealing that she hadn't really grasped the English rule. Apparently, the defective gene in this family somehow affects the development of the rules that normal children use unconsciously. The adults do their best to compensate by consciously reasoning the rules out, with predictably clumsy results. Broca's aphasia and SLI are cases where language is impaired and the rest of intelligence seems more or less intact. But this does not show that language is separate from intelligence. Perhaps language imposes greater demands on the brain than any other problem the mind has to solve. For the other problems, the brain can limp along at less than its full capacity. For language, all systems have to be 100%. To clinch the case, we need to find the opposite dissociation, that is, people with good language and bad cognition. Here is an interview, this one between a 14-year-old girl called Denise and the late psycholinguist Richard Kromer. The interview was transcribed and analysed by Kromer's colleague, Sigrid Lipke. Denise: I like opening cards. I had a pile of posts this morning and not one of them was a Christmas card, a bank statement I got this morning. Interviewer: A bank statement, I hope it was good news. Denise: No, it wasn't good news. Interviewer: Sounds like mine. Denise: my mum works over on the ward and she said, not another bank statement. I said, it's the second one in 2 days. And she said, do you want me to go to the bank for you at lunchtime? And I went, no, I'll go this time and explain it myself. I tell you what, my bank are awful. They've lost my bank book, you see, and I can't find it anywhere. I belong to the TSB bank, and I'm thinking of changing my bank because they're so awful. They keep losing. Someone comes in to bring some tea. Oh, isn't that nice? Interviewer: very good. Denise: They've got the habit of doing that. They've lost my bank book twice in a month, and I think I'll scream. My mum went yesterday to the bank for me. She said, they've lost your bank book again. I went, can I scream? And she went, yes, go on. So I hollered. But it is annoying when they do things like that. TSB trustees aren't the best ones to be with, actually. They're hopeless. I have seen Denise on videotape, and she comes across as a loquacious, sophisticated conversationalist. It comes as a surprise to learn that the events she relates so earnestly are figments of her imagination. Denise has no bank account, so she could not have received any statements in the mail, nor could her bank have lost her bank book. Though she would talk about a joint bank account she shared with her boyfriend, she had no boyfriend, and obviously had only the most tenuous grasp of the concept joint bank account, because she complained about the boyfriend taking money out of her side of the account. In fact, Denise is severely retarded. She never learned to read or write, and cannot handle money or any of the other demands of everyday functioning. Denise was born with spina bifida, split spine, a malformation of the vertebrae that leaves the spinal cord unprotected. Spina bifida often results in hydrocephalus, an increase in pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid filling the ventricles, large cavities, of the brain, distending the brain from within. For reasons no one understands, hydrocephalic children occasionally end up, like Denise, significantly retarded, but with unimpaired, indeed overdeveloped, language skills. Perhaps the ballooning ventricles crush much of the brain tissue necessary for everyday intelligence, but leave intact some other portions that can develop language circuitry. The various technical terms for the condition include cocktail party conversation and chatterbox syndrome. Fluent grammatical language can in fact appear in many kinds of people with severe intellectual impairments like schizophrenics, Alzheimer's patients, some autistic children, and some aphasics. One of the most fascinating syndromes recently came to light when the parents of a retarded girl with chatterbox syndrome in San Diego read an article about Chomsky's theories in a popular science magazine and called him at MIT, suggesting that their daughter might be of interest to him. Chomsky is a paper and pencil theoretician who wouldn't know Jabba the Hutt from the Cookie Monster, so he suggested that the parents bring their child to the laboratory of the psycholinguist Ursula Belugi in La Jolla. Belugi, working with colleagues in molecular biology, neurology and radiology, found that the child, whom they called Crystal, and a number of others they've subsequently tested, had a rare form of retardation called Williams syndrome. The syndrome seems to be associated with a defective gene on chromosome 11 involved in the regulation of calcium, and it acts in complex ways on the brain, skull, and internal organs during development, though no one knows why it has the effects it does. The children have an unusual appearance. They are short and slight, with narrow faces and broad foreheads, flat nasal bridges, sharp chins, star-shaped patterns in their irises, and full lips. They are sometimes called elfin-faced or pixie people. They are significantly retarded, with an IQ of about 50, and are incompetent at ordinary tasks like tying their shoes, finding their way, retrieving items from a cupboard, telling left from right, adding 2 numbers, and suppressing their natural tendency to hug strangers. But like Denise, they are fluent, if somewhat prim, conversationalists. Here is a transcript from Crystal when she was 18. And what an elephant is, it is one of the animals. And what the elephant does, it lives in the jungle. It can also live in the zoo, and what it has long grey ears, fan ears, ears that can blow in the wind. It has a long trunk that can pick up grass or pick up hay. If they're in a bad mood, it can be terrible. If the elephant gets mad, it could stomp, it could charge. Sometimes elephants can charge like a bull can charge. They have big, long tusks. They can damage a car. It could be dangerous. When they're in a pinch, when they're in a bad mood, it can be terrible. You don't want an elephant as a pet. You want a cat or a dog or a bird. Laboratory tests confirm the impression of competence at grammar. The children understand complex sentences and fix up ungrammatical sentences at normal levels. And they have an especially charming quirk. They are fond of unusual words. Ask a normal child to name some animals, and you will get the standard inventory of pet store and barnyard. Dog, cat, horse, cow, pig. Ask a Williams syndrome child, and you get a more interesting menagerie. Unicorn, pteranodon, yak, ibex, water buffalo, sea lions, saber-toothed tiger, vulture, koala, and dragon. One 11-year-old poured a glass of milk into the sink and said, "I'll have to evacuate it." Another handed Belugi a drawing and announced, "Here, Doc, this is in remembrance of you." The people I have mentioned so far constitute a field guide to language users. They show that complex grammar is displayed across the full range of human habitats. You don't need to have left the Stone Age. You don't need to be middle class. You don't need to do well in school. You don't even need to be old enough for school. Your parents need not bathe you in language or even command a language. You don't need the intellectual wherewithal to function in society, the skills to keep house and home together, or a particularly firm grip on reality. Indeed, you can possess all these advantages and still not be a competent language user if you lack just the right genes or just the right bits of brain. Is thought dependent on words? Do people literally think in English, Cherokee or Kivungjo? Or are our thoughts couched in some silent medium of the brain, a language of thought or mentalese, and merely clothed in words whenever we need to communicate them to a listener? No question could be more central to understanding the language instinct. In much of our social and political discourse, people simply assume that words determine thoughts. Pundits accuse governments of manipulating our minds with euphemisms like pacification, bombing, revenue enhancement, taxes, and non-retention, firing. Philosophers argue that since animals lack language, they must also lack consciousness. Wittgenstein wrote, "A dog could not have the thought, perhaps it will rain tomorrow, and therefore they do not possess the rights of conscious beings." Some feminists blame sexist thinking on sexist language, like the use of he to refer to a generic person. Inevitably, reform movements have sprung up, and many replacements for he have been suggested. Heesh, po, te, vi, z, and here. The most extreme of these movements is general semantics, begun in 1933 by the engineer Count Alfred Korzybski. General semantics lays the blame for human folly on insidious semantic damage to thought perpetrated by the structure of language. Keeping a 40-year-old in prison for a theft he committed as a teenager assumes that the 40-year-old John and the 18-year-old John are the same person, a cruel logical error that would be avoided if we referred to them not as John, but as John 1972 and John 1994, respectively. The verb to be is a particular source of illogic because it identifies individuals with abstractions, as in, Mary is a woman, and licenses evasions of responsibility like Ronald Reagan's famous non-confession, mistakes were made. One faction seeks to eradicate the verb altogether. And supposedly there is a scientific basis for these assumptions. The famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic determinism, stating that people's thoughts are determined by the categories made available by their language, and its weaker version, linguistic relativity, stating that differences among languages cause differences in the thoughts of their speakers. People who remember little else from their college education can rattle off the factoids. The languages that carve the spectrum into colour words at different places, the fundamentally different Hopi concept of time, the dozens of Eskimo words for snow. The implication is heavy. The foundational categories of reality are not in the world, but are imposed by one's culture, and hence can be challenged, perhaps accounting for the perennial appeal of the hypothesis to undergraduate sensibilities. But it is wrong. All wrong. The idea that thought is the same thing as language is an example of what can be called a conventional absurdity, a statement that goes against all common sense, but that everyone believes because they dimly recall having heard it somewhere and because it is so pregnant with implications. Think about it. We have all had the experience of uttering or writing a sentence, then stopping and realizing that it wasn't exactly what we meant to say. To have that feeling, there has to be a what we meant to say that is different from what we said. Sometimes it's not easy to find any words that properly convey a thought. When we hear or read, we usually remember the gist, not the exact words, so there has to be such a thing as a gist that is not the same as a bunch of words. And if thoughts depended on words, how could a new word ever be coined? How could a child learn a word to begin with? How could translation from one language to another be possible? The discussions that assume that language determines thought carry on only by a collective suspension of disbelief. A dog, Bertrand Russell noted, may not be able to tell you that its parents were honest though poor, but can anyone really conclude from this that the dog is unconscious? As for government euphemism, it is contemptible not because it is a form of mind control, but because it is a form of lying. As we shall see, there is no scientific evidence that languages dramatically shape their speakers' ways of thinking. The idea that language shapes thinking seemed plausible when scientists were in the dark about how thinking works, or even how to study it. Now that cognitive scientists know how to think about thinking, there is less of a temptation to equate it with language just because words are more palpable than thoughts. Benjamin Lee Whorf wrote that the Hopi language contains no words, grammatical forms, constructions, or expressions that refer directly to what we call time, or to past or future. What then are we to make of the following sentence translated from Hopi? Then indeed, the following day, quite early in the morning, at the hour when people pray to the sun, around that time, then he woke up the girl again. Among Whorf's other impressions, colour is surely the most eye-catching. He noted that we see objects in different hues, depending on the wavelength of the light they reflect. But physicists tell us that wavelength is a continuous dimension with nothing delineating red, yellow, green, blue, and so on. Languages differ in their inventory of colour words. Latin lacks generic grey and brown. Navajo collapses blue and green into one word. Russian has distinct words for dark blue and sky blue. Shona speakers use one word for the yellower greens and the greener yellows, and a different one for the bluer greens and the non-purplish blues. You can fill in the rest of the argument. It is language that puts the frets in the spectrum. But although physicists see no basis for colour boundaries, physiologists do. Eyes do not register wavelength the way a thermometer registers temperature. They contain 3 kinds of cones, each with a different pigment, and the cones are wired to neurons in a way that makes the neurons respond best to red patches against a green background or vice versa, blue against yellow, black against white. No matter how influential language might be, it would seem preposterous to a physiologist that it could reach down into the retina and rewire ganglion cells. Indeed, humans the world over colour their perceptual worlds using the same palette, and this constrains the vocabularies they develop. Although languages may disagree about the wrappers in the 64 crayon box, the burnt umbers, the turquoises, the fuchsias, they agree much more on the wrappers in the 8 crayon box, the fire engine reds, grass greens, lemon yellows. Speakers of different languages unanimously pick these shades as the best examples of their colour words, as long as the language has a colour word in that general part of the spectrum. And where languages do differ in their colour words, they differ predictably. Languages are organised a bit like the Crayola product line, the fancier ones adding colours to the more basic ones. If a language has only 2 colour words, they are for black and white, usually encompassing dark and light respectively. If it has 3, they are for black, white, and red. If 4, black, white, red, and either yellow or green. 5 adds in both yellow and green. 6, blue. 7, brown, more than 7, purple, pink, orange, or grey. But the clinching experiment was carried out in the New Guinea highlands with the Grand Valley Dani, a people speaking one of the black and white languages. The psychologist Eleanor Roche found that the Dani were quicker at learning a new colour category that was based on fire engine red than a category based on an off red. The way we see colours determines how we learn words for them, not vice versa. Speaking of anthropological canards, no discussion of language and thought would be complete without the great Eskimo vocabulary hoax. Contrary to popular belief, the Eskimos do not have more words for snow than do speakers of English. They do not have 400 words for snow, as it has been claimed in print, or 200, or 100, or 48, or even 9. One dictionary puts the figure at 2. Counting generously, experts can come up with about a dozen, but by such standards, English would not be far behind with snow, sleet, slush, blizzard, avalanche, hail, hardpack, powder, flurry, and dusting. Where did the myth come from? Not from anyone who's actually studied the Yupik and Inuit-Inupiaq families of polysynthetic languages spoken from Siberia to Greenland. The anthropologist Laura Martin has documented how the story grew like an urban legend, exaggerated with each retelling. The linguist Geoffrey Pullum, who popularized Martin's article in his essay, The Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax, speculates about why the story got so out of control. The alleged lexical extravagance of the Eskimo comports so well with the many other facets of their polysynthetic perversity, rubbing noses, lending their wives to strangers, eating raw seal blubber, throwing grandma out to be eaten by polar bears. People can be forgiven for overrating language. Words make noise or sit on a page for all to hear and see. Thoughts are trapped inside the head of the thinker. To know what someone else is thinking, or to talk to each other about the nature of thinking, we have to use what else? Words. It is no wonder that many commentators have trouble even conceiving of thought without words. Or is it that they just don't have the language to talk about it? As a cognitive scientist, I can afford to be smug about thought being different from language, and linguistic determinism being a conventional absurdity. For 2 sets of tools now make it easier to think clearly about the whole problem. One is a body of experimental studies that break the word barrier and assess many kinds of non-verbal thought. The other is a theory of how thinking might work that formulates the questions in a satisfyingly precise way. There are languageless beings who've been studied experimentally, and volumes have been written about how they reason about space, time, objects, number, rate, causality, and categories. Let me recount 3 ingenious examples. One involves babies, who cannot think in words because they have not yet learned any. One involves monkeys, who cannot think in words because they're incapable of learning them. The third involves human adults who, whether or not they think in words, claim their best thinking is done without them. The developmental psychologist Karen Wynne has recently shown that 5-month-old babies can do simple mental arithmetic. She used a technique common in infant perception research. Show a baby a bunch of objects long enough, and the baby gets bored and looks away. Change the scene, and if the baby notices the difference, he or she will regain interest. The methodology has shown that babies as young as 5 days old are sensitive to number. In one experiment, an experimenter bores a baby with an object, then occludes the object with an opaque screen. When the screen is removed, if the same object is present, the babies look for a little while, then get bored again. But if, through invisible subterfuge, 2 or 3 objects have ended up there, the surprised babies stare longer. In Wynne's experiment, the babies were shown a rubber Mickey Mouse doll on a stage until their eyes wandered. Then a screen came up, and a prancing hand visibly reached out from behind a curtain and placed a second Mickey Mouse behind the screen. When the screen was removed, if there were 2 Mickey Mouses visible, something the babies had never actually seen, the babies looked for only a few moments. But if there was only 1 doll, the babies were captivated, even though this was exactly the scene that had bored them before the screen was put in place. Wynne also tested a second group of babies, and this time, after the screen came up to obscure a pair of dolls, A hand visibly reached behind the screen and removed one of them. If the screen fell to reveal a single Mickey, the babies looked briefly. If it revealed the old scene with two, the babies had more trouble tearing themselves away. The babies must have been keeping track of how many dolls were behind the screen, updating their counts as dolls were added or subtracted. If the number inexplicably departed from what they expected, they scrutinized the scene as if searching for some explanation. Vervet monkeys live in stable groups of adult males and females and their offspring. The primatologists Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth have noticed that extended families form alliances. In a typical interaction, they observed, one juvenile monkey wrestled another to the ground screaming. 20 minutes later, the victim's sister approached the perpetrator's sister and without provocation bit her on the tail. For the retaliator to have identified the proper target, she would have had to solve the following analogy problem. A, victim, is to B, myself as C, perpetrator, is to X, using the correct relationship sister of, or perhaps merely relative of. But do monkeys really know how their group mates are related to each other? And more impressively, do they realize that different pairs of individuals like brothers and sisters can be related in the same way? Cheney and Seyfarth hid a loudspeaker behind a bush and played tapes of a 2-year-old monkey screaming. The females in the area reacted by looking at the mother of the infant who had been recorded, showing that they not only recognized the infant by its scream, but recalled who its mother was. Similar abilities have been shown in the long-tailed macaques that Verena Dasser coaxed into a laboratory adjoining a large outdoor enclosure. 3 slides were projected, a mother at the center, one of her offspring on one side, and an unrelated juvenile of the same age and sex on the other. Each screen had a button under it. After the monkey had been trained to press a button under the offspring slide, it was tested on pictures of other mothers in the group, each one flanked by a picture of that mother's offspring and a picture of another juvenile. More than 90% of the time, the monkey picked the offspring. In another test, the monkey was shown 2 slides, each showing a pair of monkeys, and was trained to press a button beneath the slide showing a particular mother and her juvenile daughter. When presented with slides of new monkeys in the group, the subject monkey always picked the mother and offspring pair, whether the offspring was male, female, infant, juvenile, or adult. Moreover, the monkeys appeared to be relying not only on physical resemblance between a given pair of monkeys, or on the sheer number of hours they had previously spent together as the basis for recognizing they were kin, but on something more subtle in the history of their interaction. Many creative people insist that in their most inspired moments, they think not in words, but in mental images. Many contemporary novelists, like Joan Didion, report that their acts of creation begin not with any notion of a character or a plot, but with vivid mental pictures that dictate their choice of words. Physical scientists are even more adamant that their thinking is geometrical, not verbal. Michael Faraday, the originator of our modern conception of electric and magnetic fields, had no training in mathematics, but arrived at his insights by visualizing lines of force as narrow tubes curving through space. James Clerk Maxwell formalized the concepts of electromagnetic fields in a set of mathematical equations, and is considered the prime example of an abstract theoretician, but he set down the equations only after mentally playing with elaborate imaginary models of sheets and fluids. Friedrich Kekule's discovery of the benzene ring that kicked off modern organic chemistry, Ernest Lawrence's conception of the cyclotron, James Watson and Francis Crick's discovery of the DNA double helix, all came to them in images. The most famous self-described visual thinker is Albert Einstein, who arrived at some of his insights by imagining himself riding a beam of light and looking back at a clock. or dropping a coin while standing in a plummeting elevator. He wrote, "The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. This combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought, before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others. The above-mentioned elements are, in my case, of visual and some muscular type. Conventional words or other signs have to be sought for laboriously only in a secondary state, when the mentioned associative play is sufficiently established and can be reproduced at will." Another creative scientist, the cognitive psychologist Roger Shepard, had his own moment of sudden visual inspiration, and it led to a classic laboratory demonstration of mental imagery in mere mortals. Early one morning, suspended between sleep and awakening in a state of lucid consciousness, Shepard experienced a spontaneous kinetic image of three-dimensional structures majestically turning in space. Within moments and before fully awakening, Shepard had a clear idea for the design of an experiment. A simple variant of his idea was later carried out with his then-student Lynn Cooper. Cooper and Shepard flashed thousands of slides, each showing a single letter of the alphabet, to their long-suffering student volunteers. Sometimes the letter was upright, but sometimes it was tilted, or mirror-reversed, or both. The subjects were asked to press one button if the letter was normal, and another if it was a mirror image. To do the task, the subjects had to compare the letter in the slide against some memory record of what the normal version of the letter looks like right side up. Obviously, the right side up slide, 0 degrees, is the quickest because it matches the letter in memory exactly. But for the other orientations, some mental transformation to the upright is necessary first. Many subjects reported that they, like the famous sculptors and scientists, mentally rotated an image of the letter to the upright. By looking at the reaction times, Shepard and Cooper showed that this introspection was accurate. The upright letters were fastest, followed by the 45-degree letters, the 90-degree letters, and the 135-degree letters, with the 180-degree, upside-down letters, the slowest. In other words, the farther the subject had to mentally rotate the letter, the longer they took. From the data, Cooper and Shepard estimated that letters revolve in the mind at a rate of 56 RPM. Note that if the subjects had been manipulating something resembling verbal descriptions of the letters, such as for F, an upright spine with one horizontal segment that extends rightwards from the top and another horizontal segment that extends rightwards from the middle, the results would have been very different. Among all the topsy-turvy letters, the upside-down versions, 180 degrees, should be fastest. One simply switches all the tops to bottoms and vice versa, and the lefts to rights and vice versa, and one has a new description of the shape as it would appear right side up, suitable for matching against memory. Sideways letters, 90 degrees, should be slower. Diagonal letters should be slowest because every word in the description has to be replaced. Top has to be replaced with either top right or top left, and so on. So the order of difficulty should be 0, 180, 90, 45, 135, not the majestic rotation of 0, 45, 90, 135, 180 that Cooper and Shepard saw in the data. Many other experiments have corroborated the idea that visual thinking uses not language, but a mental graphics system with operations that rotate, scan, zoom, pan, displace, and fill in patterns of contours. What sense, then, can we make of the suggestion that images, numbers, kinship relations, or logic can be represented in the brain without being couched in words? In the first half of this century, philosophers had an answer. None. A logical error, they said. A picture in the head would require a little man to look at it. And what would be inside his head? Even smaller pictures with an even smaller man looking at them? But the argument was unsound. It took Alan Turing, the brilliant British mathematician and philosopher, to make the idea of a mental representation scientifically respectable. Turing described a hypothetical machine that could be said to engage in reasoning. In fact, this Turing machine clearly uses an internal symbolic representation, a kind of mental ease, without requiring a little man. In essence, to reason is to deduce new pieces of knowledge from old ones. By looking at how a Turing machine works, we can get a grasp of what it would mean for a human mind to think in mentalese as opposed to English. The first key idea is a representation, a physical object whose parts and arrangement correspond to some set of ideas or facts. For example, the pattern of ink on a page. Socrates is a man. Now, though I am using the example of ink marks in the shape of English words, all that really matters is that they have different shapes. I could have used a Star of David, a smiley face, and the Mercedes-Benz logo, as long as I used them consistently. Keeping this convention in mind, now imagine that the page has a second set of ink marks. Every man is mortal. To get reasoning to happen, we now need a processor. A processor is a gadget with a fixed number of reflexes that can react to different pieces of a representation and do something in response, including altering the representation or making new ones. For example, imagine a machine that can move around on a printed page. It has a cutout in the shape of the letter sequence is A, and a light sensor that can tell when the cutout is superimposed on a set of ink marks in the exact shape of the cutout. The sensor is hooked to a copier which can duplicate any set of ink marks or make them into a new cutout. Now imagine that this sensor copier creeper machine is wired up with 4 reflexes. First, it rolls down the page, and whenever it detects is A, ink marks, it moves to the left and copies the ink marks it finds there onto the bottom of the page. Its second reflex, also in response to finding an is A, is to go to the right of that is A and copy any ink marks it finds there into a new cutout. Its third reflex is to scan down the page, checking for ink marks shaped like every, and then see if the ink marks to the right align with its new cutout. Its fourth reflex, upon finding such a match, is to move to the right and copy the ink marks it finds there onto the bottom of the page. Now our page looks like this. Socrates is a man, and below that, every man is mortal, and along the bottom of the page our sensor copier creeper machine has printed Socrates is mortal. A primitive kind of reasoning has taken place. Crucially, although the gadget and the page collectively display a kind of intelligence, there is nothing in either of them that is itself intelligent. Gadget and page are just a bunch of ink marks, cutouts, photocells, lasers and wires. The machine blindly responds to the shape of the ink marks, but it does so, it scans, moves and prints, in exact correspondence to a logical rule. What makes it intelligent is that the sequence of sensing and moving and copying results in its printing a representation of a conclusion that is true if, and only if, the page contains representations of premises that are true. Now, this example uses ink marks on paper as its representation and a copying, creeping sensing machine as its processor. But the representation can be in any physical medium as long as the patterns are used consistently. In the brain, there might be 3 groups of neurons, one used to represent the individual that the proposition is about, Socrates, Aristotle, Rod Stewart, and so on. One to represent the logical relationship in the proposition, is a, is not, is like, and so on. And one to represent the class or type that the individual is being categorized as, men, dogs, chickens, and so on. Or the whole thing could be done in silicon chips. But in all three cases, the principles are the same. The way the elements in the processor are wired up would cause them to sense and copy pieces of a representation and produce new representations in a way that mimics the rules of reasoning. With many thousands of representations and a set of somewhat more sophisticated processors, you might have a genuinely intelligent brain or computer. Add an eye that can detect contours in the world and turn on representations that symbolize them, and muscles that can act on the world whenever certain representations symbolizing goals are turned on, and you have a behaving organism. This, in a nutshell, is the theory of thinking called the physical symbol system hypothesis, or the computational or representational theory of mind. It is fundamental to cognitive science, and cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists are trying to find out what kinds of representations and processors the brain has. Now we are in a position to pose the Whorfian question in a precise way. Remember that a representation does not have to look like English or any other language. It just has to use symbols to represent concepts and arrangements of symbols to represent the logical relations among them according to some consistent scheme. But though internal representations in an English speaker's mind don't have to look like English, they could, in principle, look like English or like whatever language the person happens to speak. So here is the question. Do they, in fact? For example, if we know that Socrates is a man, is it because we have neural patterns that correspond one-to-one to the English words Socrates is a and man, and groups of neurons in the brain that correspond to the subject of an English sentence, the verb, and the object laid out in that order? Or do we use some other code for representing concepts and their relations in our heads, a language of thought or mental ease that is not the same as any of the world's languages? We can answer this question by seeing whether English sentences embody the information that a processor would need to perform valid sequences of reasoning. The answer is a clear no. English, or any other language people speak, is hopelessly unsuited to serve as our internal medium of computation. Consider some of the problems. The first is ambiguity. These headlines actually appeared in newspapers. Child's stool, great for use in garden. Stiff opposition expected to casketless funeral plan. Drunk gets 9 months in violin case. Iraqi head seeks arms. Queen Mary having bottom scraped. Each headline contains a word that is ambiguous. But surely the thought underlying the word is not ambiguous. The writers of the headlines surely knew which of the two senses of the word stool and stiff they had in mind. But if there can be two thoughts corresponding to one word, thoughts can't be words. The second problem with English is its lack of logical explicitness. Consider the following example devised by the computer scientist Drew McDermott. Ralph is an elephant. Elephants live in Africa. Elephants have tusks. Our inference-making device would deduce Ralph lives in Africa and Ralph has tusks. This sounds fine, but isn't. You, the listener, know that the Africa Ralph lives in is the same Africa that all the other elephants live in, but that Ralph's tusks are his own. But the symbol copier creeper sensor that is supposed to be a model of you doesn't know that, because the distinction is nowhere to be found in the statements. If you object that this is just common sense, you would be right, but it's common sense that we're trying to account for, and English sentences do not embody the information that a processor needs to carry out common sense. A third problem is called co-reference. Say you start talking about an individual by referring to him as the tall blonde man with one black shoe. The second time you refer to him, you're likely to call him the man. The third time, just him. But the three expressions do not refer to three people. The second and third are just ways of saving breath. Something in the brain must treat them as the same thing. English isn't doing it. A fourth, related problem comes from those aspects of language that can only be interpreted in the context of a conversation or text, what linguists call deixis. Consider articles like a and the. What is the difference between killed a policeman and killed the policeman? Only that in the second sentence it is assumed that some specific policeman was mentioned earlier or is salient in the context. Thus, in isolation, the two phrases are synonymous, but in the following contexts, their meanings are completely different. A policeman's 14-year-old son, apparently enraged after being disciplined for a bad grade, opened fire from his house, killing a policeman and wounding 3 people before he was shot dead. A policeman's 14-year-old son, apparently enraged after being disciplined for a bad grade, opened fire from his house, killing the policeman and wounding 3 people before he was shot dead. Outside of a particular conversation or text, then, the words a and the are quite meaningless. They have no place in one's permanent mental database. Other conversation-specific words like here, there, this, that, now, then, I, me, my, her, we, and you pose the same problems as the following old joke illustrates. First guy. I didn't sleep with my wife before we were married, did you? Second guy. I don't know, what was her maiden name? A fifth problem is synonymy. The sentence is, Sam sprayed paint onto the wall. Sam sprayed the wall with paint. Paint was sprayed onto the wall by Sam. The wall was sprayed with paint by Sam. Refer to the same event and therefore license many of the same inferences. For example, in all 4 cases, one may conclude that the wall has paint on it. But there are 4 distinct arrangements of words. You know that they mean the same thing, but no simple processor crawling over them as marks would know that. Something else that is not one of those arrangements of words must be representing a single event that you know is common to all 4. For example, the event might be represented as something like unit, Sam spray paint, cause, unit, paint go to, subunit, on wall, which, assuming we don't take the English words seriously, is not too far from one of the leading proposals about what mental ease looks like. These examples illustrate a single important point. The representations underlying thinking on the one hand, and the sentences in a language on the other, are in many ways at cross purposes. Any particular thought in our head embraces a vast amount of information. But when it comes to communicating a thought to someone else, attention spans are short and mouths are slow. To get information into a listener's head in a reasonable amount of time, a speaker can encode only a fraction of the message into words and must count on the listener to fill in the rest. But inside a single head, the demands are different. Airtime is not a limited resource. Different parts of the brain are connected to one another directly with thick cables that can transfer huge amounts of information quickly. Nothing can be left to the imagination, though, because the internal representations are the imagination. We end up with the following picture. People do not think in English or Chinese or Apache. They think in a language of thought. This language of thought probably looks a bit like all these languages. Presumably it has symbols for concepts and arrangements of symbols that correspond to who did what to whom as in the paint-spraying representation described above. But compared with any given language, mentalese must be richer in some ways and simpler in others. It must be richer, for example, in that several concept symbols must correspond to a given English word like stool. There must be extra paraphernalia that differentiate logically distinct kinds of concepts, like Ralph's tusks versus tusks in general, and that link different symbols that refer to the same thing, like the tall blonde man with one black shoe, and the man. On the other hand, mentalese must be simpler than spoken languages. Conversation-specific words and constructions like a and the are absent, and information about pronouncing words or even ordering them is unnecessary. Now, it could be that English speakers think in some kind of simplified and annotated quasi-English, with the design I have just described, and that Apache speakers think in a simplified and annotated quasi-Apache. But to get these languages of thought to subserve reasoning properly, they would have to look much more like each other than either one does to its spoken counterpart, and it is likely that they are the same. A universal mentalese. Knowing a language, then, is knowing how to translate mentalese into strings of words, and vice versa. People without a language would still have a mentalese, and babies and many non-human animals presumably have simpler dialects. Indeed, if babies did not have a mentalese to translate to and from English, it's not clear how learning English could take place, or even what learning English would mean. Journalists say that when a dog bites a man, that is not news, but when a man bites a dog, that is news. This is the essence of the language instinct. Language conveys news. The streams of words called sentences are not just memory prods, reminding you of man and man's best friend and letting you fill in the rest. They tell you who in fact did what to whom. Thus we get more from most stretches of language than Woody Allen got from War and Peace, which he read in 2 hours after taking speed reading lessons. It was about some Russians. Language allows us to know how octopuses make love, and how to remove stains, and why Tad was heartbroken, and how to build an atom bomb in your basement, and how Catherine the Great died, among other things. When scientists see some apparent magic trick in nature, like bats homing in on insects in pitch blackness, or salmon returning to breed in their natal stream, they look for the engineering principles behind it. For bats, the trick turned out to be sonar. For salmon, it was locking into a faint scent trail. What is the trick behind the ability of Homo sapiens to convey that man bites dog? In fact, there is not one trick but 2, and they are associated with the names of 2 European scholars who wrote in the 19th century. The first principle, articulated by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, is the arbitrariness of the sign, the wholly conventional pairing of a sound with a meaning. The word dog does not look like a dog, walk like a dog, or woof like a dog, but it means dog just the same. It does so because every English speaker has undergone an identical act of rote learning in childhood that links the sound to the meaning. For the price of this standardized memorization, the members of a language community receive an enormous benefit: the ability to convey a concept from mind to mind virtually instantaneously. But think about the sane alternative of depicting a concept so that receivers can apprehend the meaning in the form. The process is so challenging to the ingenuity, so comically unreliable, that we've made it into party games like Pictionary and charades. The second trick behind the language instinct is captured in a phrase from Wilhelm von Humboldt that presaged Chomsky. Language makes infinite use of finite media. We know the difference between the forgettable dog bites man and the newsworthy man bites dog because of the order in which dog, man and bytes are combined. That is, we use a code to translate between orders of words and combinations of thoughts. That code or set of rules is called a generative grammar. As I have mentioned, it should not be confused with the pedagogical and stylistic grammars we encountered in school. The principle underlying grammar is unusual in the natural world. A grammar is an example of a discrete combinatorial system. A finite number of discrete elements, in this case words, are sampled, combined, and permuted to create larger structures, in this case sentences, with properties that are quite distinct from those of their elements. For example, the meaning of man bites dog is different from the meaning of any of the 3 words inside it, and different from the meaning of the same words combined in the reverse order. In a discrete combinatorial system like language, there can be an unlimited number of completely distinct combinations with an infinite range of properties. Another noteworthy discrete combinatorial system in the natural world is the genetic code in DNA, where 4 kinds of nucleotides are combined into 64 kinds of codons, and the codons can be strung into an unlimited number of different genes. Many biologists have capitalized on the close parallel between the principles of grammatical combination and the principles of genetic combination. In the technical language of genetics, sequences of DNA are said to contain letters, and punctuation, may be palindromic, meaningless or synonymous, are transcribed and translated, and are even stored in libraries. The immunologist Niels Jerry entitled his Nobel Prize address, "The Generative Grammar of the Immune System." Most of the complicated systems we see in the world, in contrast, are blending systems, like geology, paint mixing, cooking, sound, light, and weather. In a blending system, the properties of the combination lie between the properties of its elements, and the properties of the elements are lost in the average, or mixture. For example, combining red paint and white paint results in pink paint. Thus, the range of properties that can be found in a blending system are highly circumscribed, and the only way to differentiate large numbers of combinations is to discriminate tinier and tinier differences. It may not be a coincidence that the 2 systems in the universe that most impress us with their open-ended, complex design, life and mind, are based on discrete combinatorial systems. Many biologists believe that if inheritance were not discrete, evolution as we know it could not have taken place. The way language works, then, is that each person's brain contains a lexicon of words and the concepts they stand for, a mental dictionary, and a set of rules that combine the words to convey relationships among concepts, a mental grammar. The fact that grammar is a discrete combinatorial system has 2 important consequences. The first is the sheer vastness of language. Go into the Library of Congress and pick a sentence at random from any volume, and chances are you would fail to find an exact repetition, no matter how long you continued to search. Estimates of the number of sentences that an ordinary person is capable of producing are breathtaking. If a speaker is interrupted at a random point in a sentence, there are on average about 10 different words that could be inserted at that point to continue the sentence in a grammatical and meaningful way. At some points in a sentence only 1 word can be inserted, and at others there is a choice from among thousands. 10 is the average. Let's assume that a person is capable of producing sentences up to 20 words long. Therefore, the number of sentences that a speaker can deal with in principle is at least 100 million trillion. At a rate of 5 seconds a sentence, a person would need a childhood of about 100 trillion years to memorize them all. Indeed, if you put aside the fact that the days of our age are 70, each of us is capable of uttering an infinite number of different sentences. By the same logic that shows that there are an infinite number of integers, if you ever think you have the largest integer, just add 1 to it and you will have another, there must be an infinite number of sentences. The Guinness Book of World Records once claimed to recognize the longest English sentence, a 1,300-word stretch in William Faulkner's novel Absalom, Absalom, that begins, "They both bore it as though in deliberate flagellant exultation." I'm tempted to achieve immortality by submitting the following record breaker. Faulkner wrote, "They both bore it as though in deliberate flagellant exultation." But it would be only the proverbial 15 minutes of fame, for soon I could be bested by, Pinker wrote that Faulkner wrote, "They both bore it as though in deliberate flagellant exultation." And that record too would fall when someone submitted, "Who cares that Pinker wrote that Faulkner wrote they both bore it as though in deliberate flagellant exultation?" And so on, ad infinitum. The infinite use of finite media distinguishes the human brain from virtually all the artificial language devices we commonly come across, like pull-string dolls, cars that nag you to close the door, and cheery voicemail instructions. Press the pound key for more options, all of which use a fixed list of prefabricated sentences. The second consequence of the design of grammar is that it is a code that is autonomous from cognition. A grammar specifies how words may combine to express meanings. That specification is independent of the particular meanings we typically convey or expect others to convey to us. Thus, we all sense that some strings of words that can be given common-sense interpretations do not conform to the grammatical code of English. Here are some strings that we can easily interpret, but that we sense are not properly formed. "Welcome to Chinese restaurant. Please try your nice Chinese food with chopsticks, the traditional and typical of Chinese glorious history and cultural." "It's a flying finches they are." "The child seems sleeping." "Is raining." "Sally poured the glass with water." These sentences are ungrammatical, not in the sense of split infinitives, dangling participles, and the other hobgoblins of the schoolmarm, but in the sense that every ordinary speaker of the casual vernacular has a gut feeling that something is wrong with them, despite their interpretability. Ungrammaticality is simply a consequence of our having a fixed code for interpreting sentences. For some strings, a meaning can be guessed, but we lack confidence that the speaker has used the same code in producing the sentence as we used in interpreting it. The opposite can happen as well. Sentences can make no sense, but can still be recognized as grammatical. The classic example is a sentence contrived by Chomsky to show that syntax and sense can be independent of each other. "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." But the point was made long before Chomsky. The genre of nonsense verse and prose, popular in the 19th century, depends on it. Here is an example from Edward Lear, the acknowledged master of nonsense. "It's a fact the whole world knows that pobbles are happier without their toes." And almost everyone knows the poem in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass that ends, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." As Alice said, "Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are." But though common sense and common knowledge are of no help in understanding these passages, English speakers recognize that they are grammatical, and their mental rules allow them to extract precise, though abstract, frameworks of meaning. And after reading Chomsky's sentence, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously," anyone can answer questions like, what slept? Did one thing sleep or several? What kind of ideas were they? How might the combinatorial grammar underlying human language work? The most straightforward way to combine words in order is explained in Michael Frayn's novel, The Tin Men. The protagonist, Goldwasser, is an engineer working at an institute for automation. he must devise a computer system that generates the standard kinds of stories found in the daily papers, like paralyzed girl determined to dance again. Here he is hand-testing a program that composes stories about royal occasions. He opened the filing cabinet and picked out the first card in the set. Traditionally, it read. Now there was a random choice between cards reading coronations, engagements, funerals, weddings, comings of age, births, deaths, or the churching of women. The day before, he'd picked funerals and been directed to a card reading with simple perfection, "Are occasions for mourning." Today, he closed his eyes, drew weddings, and was signposted on to "Are occasions for rejoicing." The wedding of X and Y followed in logical sequence and brought him a choice between "is no exception" and "is a case in point." Either way, there followed indeed. Indeed, whichever occasion one had started off with, whether coronations, deaths, or births, Goldwasser saw with intense mathematical pleasure one now reached this same elegant bottleneck. He paused on indeed, then drew in quick succession, "It is a particularly happy occasion." Rarely. And can there have been a more popular young couple? From the next selection, Goldwasser drew X has won himself, herself, a special place in the nation's affections, which forced him to go on to, and the British people have clearly taken Y to their hearts already. Goldwasser was surprised and a little disturbed to realize that the word fitting had still not come up, but he drew it with the next card. It is especially fitting that. This gave him the bride, bridegroom should be, and an open choice between of such a noble and illustrious line, a commoner in these democratic times, from a nation with which this country has long enjoyed a particularly close and cordial relationship, and from a nation with which this country's relations have not in the past been always happy. Feeling that he'd done particularly well with fitting last time, Goldwasser now deliberately selected it again. It is also fitting that, read the card, to be quickly followed by, we should remember, and X and Y are not merely symbols, they are a lively young man and a very lovely young woman. Goldwasser shut his eyes to draw the next card. It turned out to read, in these days when. He pondered whether to select, it is fashionable to scoff at the traditional morality of marriage and family life, or it is no longer fashionable to scoff at the traditional morality of marriage and family life. The latter had more of the form's authentic baroque splendor, he decided. Let's call this a word chain device. The technical name is a finite state or Markov model. A word chain device is a bunch of lists of words or prefabricated phrases and a set of directions for going from list to list. A processor builds a sentence by selecting a word from one list, then a word from another list, and so on. To recognize a sentence spoken by another person, one just checks the words against each list in order. Word chain systems are commonly used in satires like Frain's, usually as do-it-yourself recipes for composing examples of a kind of verbiage. Recently, I saw a word chain device that generates breathless book jacket blurbs, and another for Bob Dylan song lyrics. A word chain device is the simplest example of a discrete combinatorial system, since it is capable of creating an unlimited number of distinct combinations from a finite set of elements. Parodies notwithstanding, a word chain device can generate infinite sets of grammatical English sentences. When an engineer has to build a system to combine words in particular orders, a word chain device is the first thing that comes to mind. The recorded voice that gives you a phone number when you dial directory assistance is a good example. A human speaker is recorded uttering the 10 digits, each in 7 different sing-song patterns, one for the first position in a phone number, one for the second position, and so on. With just these 70 recordings, 10 million phone numbers can be assembled. With another 30 recordings for 3-digit area codes, 10 billion numbers are possible. In fact, there have been serious efforts to model the English language as a very large word chain. To make it as realistic as possible, the transitions from one word list to another can reflect the actual probabilities that those kinds of words follow one another in English. For example, the word that is much more likely to be followed by is than by indicates. Huge databases of these transition probabilities have been compiled by having a computer analyze bodies of English text or by asking volunteers to name the words that first come to mind after a given word or series of words. Some psychologists have suggested that human language is based on a huge word chain stored in the brain. The idea is congenial to stimulus-response theories. A stimulus elicits a spoken word as a response, then the speaker perceives his or her own response, which serves as the next stimulus, eliciting one out of several words as the next response, and so on. But the fact that word chain devices seem ready-made for parodies like Frayn's raises suspicions. The point of the various parodies is that the genre being satirized is so mindless and cliché-ridden that a simple mechanical method can churn out an unlimited number of examples that can almost pass for the real thing. The humor works because of the discrepancy between the two. We all assume that people, even sociologists and reporters, are not really word chain devices. They only seem that way. The modern study of grammar began when Chomsky showed that word chain devices are not just a bit suspicious, they are deeply, fundamentally the wrong way to think about how human language works. They are discrete combinatorial systems, but they are the wrong kind. There are 3 problems, and each one illuminates some aspect of how language really does work. First, a sentence of English is a completely different thing from a string of words chained together according to the transition probabilities of English. Remember Chomsky's sentence, "Colourless green ideas sleep furiously"? He contrived it not only to show that nonsense can be grammatical, but also to show that improbable word sequences can be grammatical. In English texts, the probability that the word colourless is followed by the word green is surely 0. So is the probability that green is followed by ideas, ideas by sleep, and sleep by furiously. Nonetheless, the string is a well-formed sentence of English. Conversely, when one actually assembles word chains using probability tables, the resulting word strings are very far from being well-formed sentences. For example, say you take estimates of the set of words most likely to come after every 4-word sequence, and use those estimates to grow a string, word by word, always looking at the 4 most recent words to determine the next one. The string will be eerily Englishy, but not English, like, "House to ask for is to earn our living by working towards a goal for his team in old New York was a wonderful place. Wasn't it even pleasant to talk about? And laugh hard when he tells lies he should not tell me. The reason why you are is evident." The discrepancy between English sentences and Englishy word chains has 2 lessons. When people learn a language, they are learning how to put words in order, but not by recording which word follows which other word. They do it by recording which word category, noun, verb, and so on, follows which other category. That is, we can recognize colourless green ideas because it has the same order of adjectives and nouns that we learned from more familiar sequences like strapless black dresses. The second lesson is that the nouns and verbs and adjectives are not just hitched end to end in one long chain. There is some overarching blueprint or plan for the sentence that puts each word in a specific slot. If a word chain device is designed with sufficient cleverness, it can deal with these problems. But Chomsky had a definitive refutation of the very idea that a human language is a word chain. He proved mathematically that certain sets of English sentences could not, even in principle, be produced by a word chain device, no matter how big or how faithful to probability tables the device is. That you'd need an infinite number of chains, which won't fit inside a finite brain. His argument may strike you as scholastic. You might object that no real person ever begins a sentence with either, if, if. So who cares whether a putative model of that person can ever complete it with then, or. But Chomsky was just using the aesthetic of the mathematician, using the interaction between either or and if-then as the simplest possible example of a property of language, its use of long-distance dependencies between an early word and a later one, to prove mathematically that word chain devices cannot handle these dependencies. But these dependencies, in fact, abound in language, and mere mortals use them all the time, over long distances, often handling several at once, just as a word chain device cannot do. And a good real-life example comes from a letter to TV Guide. How Anne Salisbury can claim that Pam Dauber's anger at not receiving her fair share of acclaim for Morecambe Mindy's success derives from a fragile ego escapes me. At the point just after the word not, the letter writer had to keep 4 grammatical commitments in mind. 1. Not requires ing, her anger at not receiving acclaim. 2. At requires some kind of noun or gerund, her anger at not receiving acclaim. 3. The singular subject, Pam Dauber's anger, requires the verb 14 words downstream to agree with it in number. Dauber's anger derives from. 4. The singular subject beginning with how requires the verb 27 words downstream to agree with it in number. How escapes me. Similarly, a reader must keep these dependencies in mind while interpreting the sentence. Now, technically speaking, one could rig up a word chain model to handle even these sentences as long as there is some actual limit on the number of dependencies that the speaker must keep in mind. 4, say. But the degree of redundancy in the device would be absurd. For each of the thousands of combinations of dependencies, an identical chain must be duplicated. In trying to fit such a superchain in a person's memory, one quickly runs out of brain. The difference between the artificial combinatorial system we see in word chain devices and the natural one we see in the human brain is summed up in a line from the Joyce Kilmer poem, "Only God can make a tree." A sentence is not a chain, but a tree. In a human grammar, words are grouped into phrases like twigs joined in a branch. The phrase is given a name, a mental symbol, and little phrases can be joined into bigger ones. Take the sentence, "The happy boy eats ice cream." It begins with 3 words that hang together as a unit, the noun phrase, "the happy boy." In English, a noun phrase is composed of a noun, sometimes preceded by an article or determiner, and any number of adjectives. All this can be captured in a rule that defines what English noun phrases look like in general. A noun phrase consists of an optional determiner followed by any number of adjectives followed by a noun. Here are 2 other rules, one defining the English sentence, the other defining the predicate or verb phrase. A sentence consists of a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. A verb phrase consists of a verb followed by a noun phrase. We now need a mental dictionary that specifies which words belong to which part of speech categories: noun, verb, adjective, preposition, determiner. Noun: boy, girl, dog, cat, ice cream, candy, hot dogs. Nouns may be drawn from the following list: boy, girl, etc. Verbs: eats, likes, bites. Verbs may be drawn from the following list: eats, likes, bites. Adjectives: happy, lucky, tall. Adjectives may be drawn from the following list: happy, lucky, tall. Determiner: a, the, one. Determiners may be drawn from the following list: a, the, one. A set of rules like the ones I have listed, a phrase structure grammar, defines a sentence by linking the words to branches on an inverted tree. The sentence branches down to the noun phrase and the verb phrase. The noun phrase branches down to the determiner, the adjective, and the noun. The verb phrase branches down to the verb, and the noun phrase which branches down to the noun. The invisible superstructure holding the words in place is a powerful invention that eliminates the problems of word chain devices. The key insight is that a tree is modular, like telephone jacks or garden hose couplers. A symbol like noun phrase is like a connector or fitting of a certain shape. It allows one component, a phrase, to snap into any of several positions inside other components, larger phrases. Once a kind of phrase is defined by a rule and given its connector symbol, it never has to be defined again. The phrase can be plugged in anywhere there is a corresponding socket. For example, in the simplified grammar I have listed, the symbol noun phrase is used both as the subject of a sentence and as the object of a verb phrase. In a more realistic grammar, it would also be used as the object of a preposition, near the boy. In a possessor phrase, the boy's hat, as an indirect object, give the boy a cookie, and in several other positions. This plug and socket arrangement explains how people can use the same kind of phrase in many different positions in a sentence, including the happy, happy boy eats ice cream. I like the happy, happy boy. I gave the happy, happy boy a cookie. The happy, happy boy's cat eats ice cream. There's no need to learn that the adjective precedes the noun rather than vice versa for the subject, and then have to learn the same thing for the object, and again for the indirect object, and yet again for the possessor. Note, too, that the promiscuous coupling of any phrase with any slot makes grammar autonomous for our common sense expectations involving the meanings of the words. It thus explains why we can write and appreciate grammatical nonsense. Our little grammar defines all kinds of colourless green sentences like the happy, happy candy likes the tall ice cream, as well as conveying such newsworthy events as the girl bites the dog. Most interestingly, the labelled branches of a phrase structure tree act as an overarching memory or plan for the whole sentence. This allows nested long-distant dependencies like if, then, and either, or to be handled with ease. All you need is a rule defining a phrase that contains a copy of the very same kind of phrase, such as a sentence can consist of the word either, followed by a sentence, followed by the word or, followed by another sentence. A sentence can consist of the word if, followed by a sentence, followed by the word then, followed by another sentence. These rules embed one instance of a symbol inside another instance of the same symbol, here a sentence inside a sentence, a neat trick which logicians call recursion, for generating an infinite number of structures. The pieces of the bigger sentence are held together in order as a set of branches growing out of a common node. That node holds together each either with its or, each if with its then, as in the following. If either the girl eats ice cream or the girl eats candy, then the boy eats hot dogs. There is another reason to believe that a sentence is held together by a mental tree. So far I've been talking about stringing words into a grammatical order, ignoring what they mean. But grouping words into phrases is also necessary to connect grammatical sentences with their proper meanings, chunks of mental ease. we know that this sentence, if either the girl eats ice cream or the girl eats candy, then the boy eats hot dogs, is about a girl, not a boy, eating ice cream, and a boy, not a girl, eating hot dogs, and we know that the boy's snack is contingent on the girl's, not vice versa. That is because girl and ice cream are connected inside their own phrase, as are boy and hot dogs, as are the two sentences involving the girl. With a chaining device, it's just one damn word after another. But with a phrase structure grammar, the connectedness of words in the tree reflects the relatedness of ideas in mentalese. Ability to learn grammar laid to gene by researcher. This 1992 headline appeared not in a supermarket tabloid, but in an Associated Press news story based on a report at the annual meeting of the Principal Scientific Association in the United States. The report had summarized evidence that specific language impairment runs in families, focusing on the British family, the Kays, we met on side 2, in which the inheritance pattern is particularly clear. The syndicated columnists James J. Kilpatrick and Irma Bombeck were incredulous. Kilpatrick's column began, "Better grammar through genetics." Researchers made a stunning announcement the other day at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Are you ready? Genetic biologists have identified the grammar gene. Yes, it appears from a news account that Steven Pinker of MIT and Myrna Gopnik of McGill University have solved a puzzle that has baffled teachers of English for years. Some pupils master grammar with no more than a few moans of protest. Others, given the same instruction, persist in saying that Susie invited her and I to the party. It is all a matter of heredity. This we can handle. A single dominant gene, the biologists believe, controls the ability to learn grammar. A child who says, "Them marbles is mine," is not necessarily stupid. He has all his marbles. The child is simply a little short on chromosomes. It boggles the mind. Before long, the researchers will isolate the gene that controls spelling, neatness, the read a book gene, a gene to turn down the boombox, another to turn off the TV, politeness, chores, homework. Bombeck wrote, "Poor grammar, it are in the genes." It was not much of a surprise to read that kids who are unable to learn grammar are missing a dominant gene. At one time in his career, my husband taught high school English. He had 37 grammar gene deficients in his class at one time. What do you think the odds of that happening are? They didn't have a clue where they were. A comma could have been a petroglyph. A subjective compliment was something you said to a friend when her hair came out right. A dangling participle was not their problem. Where is that class of young people today, you ask? They are all major sports figures, rock stars, and television personalities who make millions, spewing out words such as bummer, radical, and awesome, and thinking they are complete sentences. The syndicated columns, third-hand newspaper stories, editorial cartoons, and radio shows following the symposium gave me a quick education about how scientific discoveries get addled by journalists working under deadline pressure. To set the record straight, the discovery of the family with the inherited language disorder belongs to Gopnik. The reporter who generously shared the credit with me was confused by the fact that I chaired the session and thus introduced Gopnik to the audience. No grammar gene was identified. A defective gene was inferred from the way the syndrome runs in the family. A single gene is thought to disrupt grammar, but that does not mean a single gene controls grammar. Removing the distributor wire prevents a car from moving, but that does not mean a car is controlled by its distributor wire. And of course, what is disrupted is the ability to converse normally in everyday English, not the ability to learn the standard written dialect in school. But even when they know the facts, many people share the columnists' incredulity. Could there really be a gene tied to something as specific as grammar? The very idea is an assault on the deeply rooted belief that the brain is a general-purpose learning device, void and without form, prior to experience of the surrounding culture. As I said at the end of side 3, phrase structure is one solution to the engineering problem of taking an interconnected web of thoughts in the mind and encoding them as strings of words that must be uttered, one at a time, by the mouth. One way to see how invisible phrase structure determines meaning is to recall one of the reasons that language and thought have to be different. A particular stretch of language can correspond to two distinct thoughts. I showed you examples like child's stool is great for use in garden, where the single word stool has two meanings corresponding to two entries in the mental dictionary. But sometimes a whole sentence has two meanings, even if each individual word has only one meaning. In the movie Animal Crackers, Groucho Marx says, "I once shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know." Here are some similar ambiguities that accidentally appeared in newspapers. Tonight's programme discusses stress, exercise, nutrition and sex with Celtic forwards Scott Wedman, Dr. Ruth Westheimer and Dick Cavett. We will sell gasoline to anyone in a glass container. For sale, mixing bowl set designed to please a cook with round bottom for efficient beating. The two meanings in each sentence come from the different ways in which the words can be joined up in a tree. For example, in discuss sex with Dick Cavett, the writer put the words together according to the tree where the prepositional phrase is sex is what is to be discussed, and it is to be discussed with Dick Cavett. The alternative meaning comes from our analysing the words according to the tree where the words sex with Dick Cavett form a single branch of the tree, and sex with Dick Cavett is what is to be discussed. Phrase structure, clearly, is the kind of stuff language is made of. But what I have shown you is just a toy. Now I will try to explain the modern Chomskyan theory of how language works. Chomsky's writings are classics in Mark Twain's sense, something that everybody wants to have read and nobody wants to read. Many people have the same impatience about mastering the details of how language works that Eliza Doolittle showed to Henry Higgins in Pygmalion when she complained, "I don't want to talk grammar, I want to talk like a lady in a flower shop." For non-specialists, the reaction is even more extreme. In Shakespeare's The Second Part of King Henry VI, the rebel Dick the Butcher speaks the well-known line, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." Less well known is the second thing Dick suggests they do, behead Lord Say. Why? Here is the indictment presented by the mob's leader, Jack Cade. "Thou hast most traitorously corrupted the youth of the realm in erecting a grammar school. It will be proved to thy face that thou hast men about thee that usually talk of a noun and a verb and such abominable words as no Christian ear can endure to hear." And who can blame the grammarphobe when a typical passage from one of Chomsky's technical works reads as follows? To summarize, we have been led to the following conclusions on the assumption that the trace of a zero-level category must be properly governed. 1. VP is alpha marked by I. 2. Only lexical categories are L markers so that VP is not L marked by I. 3. Alpha government is restricted to sisterhood without the qualifications, brackets 35. But Chomsky's theory need not be treated as a set of Kabbalistic incantations that only the initiated can mutter. It is a set of discoveries about the design of language that can be appreciated intuitively if one first understands the problems to which the theory provides solutions. In fact, grasping grammatical theory provides an intellectual pleasure that is rare in the social sciences. Imagine that you are watching a nature documentary. The video shows the usual gorgeous footage of animals in their natural habitats. But the voiceover reports some troubling facts. Dolphins do not execute their swimming strokes properly. White-crowned sparrows carelessly debase their calls. Chickadees' nests are incorrectly constructed. Pandas hold bamboo in the wrong paw. The song of the humpback whale contains several well-known errors. and monkeys' cries have been in a state of chaos and degeneration for hundreds of years. Your reaction would probably be, what on earth could it mean for the song of the humpback whale to contain an error? Isn't the song of the humpback whale whatever the humpback whale decides to sing? Who is this announcer anyway? But for human language, most people think that the same pronouncements not only are meaningful, but a cause for alarm. Johnny can't construct a grammatical sentence. As educational standards decline and pop culture disseminates the inarticulate ravings and unintelligible patois of surfers, jocks, and valley girls, we are turning into a nation of functional illiterates, misusing, hopefully, confusing lie and lay, treating data as a singular noun, letting our participles dangle. English itself will steadily decay unless we get back to basics and start to respect our language again. To a linguist or psycholinguist, of course, language is like the song of the humpback whale. The way to determine whether a construction is grammatical is to find people who speak the language and ask them. So when people are accused of speaking ungrammatically in their own language or of consistently violating a rule, there must be some different sense of grammatical and rule in the air. In fact, the pervasive belief that people do not know their own language is a nuisance in doing linguistic research. A linguist's question to an informant about some form in his or her speech, say whether the person uses sneaked or snuck, is often lobbed back with the ingenuous counter-question, gee, I better not take a chance, which is correct. To resolve this contradiction, recall columnist Irma Bombeck, incredulous at the very idea of a grammar gene because her husband taught 37 high school students who thought that bummer was a sentence. You too might be wondering, if language is as instinctive as spinning a web is for a spider, if every 3-year-old is a grammatical genius, if the design of syntax is coded in our DNA and wired into our brains, why is the English language in such a mess? Why does the average American sound like a gibbering fool every time he opens his mouth or puts pen to paper? The contradiction begins in the fact that the words rule, grammatical, and ungrammatical have very different meanings to a scientist and to a lay person. The rules people learn, or more likely fail to learn in school, are called prescriptive rules, prescribing how one ought to talk. Scientists studying language propose descriptive rules, describing how people do talk. They are completely different things, and there is a good reason that scientists focus on descriptive rules. To a scientist, the fundamental fact of human language is its sheer improbability. Most objects in the universe, lakes, rocks, trees, worms, cows, cars, cannot talk. Even in humans, the utterances in a language are an infinitesimal fraction of the noises people's mouths are capable of making. I can arrange a combination of words that explains how octopuses make love or how to remove wine stains, rearrange the words in even the most minor way, and the result is a sentence with a different meaning, or, most likely of all, word salad. How are we to account for this miracle? What would it take to build a device that could duplicate human language? Obviously, you need to build in some kind of rules, but what kind? Prescriptive rules? Imagine trying to build a talking machine by designing it to obey rules like, don't split infinitives, or never begin a sentence with because. It would just sit there. In fact, we already have machines that don't split infinitives. They're called screwdrivers, bathtubs, cappuccino makers, and so on. Prescriptive rules are useless without the much more fundamental rules that create the sentences and define the infinitives and list the word because to begin with. These rules are never mentioned in style manuals or school grammars because the authors correctly assume that anyone capable of reading the manuals must already have the rules. No one, not even a valley girl, has to be told not to say, apples the eat boy, or the child seems sleeping, or who did you meet John and, or the vast, vast majority of the trillions of mathematically possible combinations of words. So when a scientist considers all the high-tech mental machinery needed to arrange words into ordinary sentences, prescriptive rules are, at best, inconsequential little decorations. The very fact that they have to be drilled shows that they are alien to the natural workings of the language system. One can choose to obsess over prescriptive rules, but they have no more to do with human language than the criteria for judging cats at a cat show have to do with mammalian biology. So there is no contradiction in saying that every normal person can speak grammatically, in the sense of systematically, and ungrammatically, in the sense of non-prescriptively, just as there is no contradiction in saying that a taxi obeys the laws of physics but breaks the laws of Massachusetts. When I entered high school in the late 1960s, Latin was undergoing a steep decline in popularity, thanks to students like me, I confess. Our Latin teacher, Mrs. Riley, tried to persuade us that Latin grammar honed the mind with its demands for precision, logic, and consistency. Mrs. Riley had a point, but Latin declensional paradigms are not the best way to convey the inherent beauty of grammar. The insights behind universal grammar are much more interesting, not only because they are more general and elegant, but because they are about living minds rather than dead tongues. Let's start with nouns and verbs. Your grammar teacher may have had you memorize some formula that equated parts of speech with kinds of meanings, like a noun's the name of anything, as school or garden, hoop or swing. Verbs tell of something being done, to read, count, sing, laugh, jump, or run. But as in most matters about language, she did not get it quite right. It is true that most names for persons, places, and things are nouns, but it is not true that most nouns are names for persons, places, or things. There are nouns with all kinds of meanings. The destruction of the city. An action. The way to San Jose. A path. 3 miles along the path. A measurement in space. It takes 3 hours to solve the problem. A measurement in time. Tell me the answer. What the answer is, a question. She is a fool. A category or kind. A meeting. An event. The square root of -2. An abstract concept. He finally kicked the bucket. No meaning at all. Likewise, though words for things being done, such as count and jump, are usually verbs, verbs can be other things, like mental states, know, like, possession, own, have, and abstract relations among ideas, falsify, prove. Conversely, a single concept like being interested can be expressed by different parts of speech. Her interest in fungi. Noun. Fungi are starting to interest her more and more. Verb. She seems interested in fungi. Fungi seem interesting to her. Adjective. Interestingly, the fungi grew an inch in an hour. Adverb. A part of speech, then, is not a kind of meaning. It is a kind of token that obeys certain formal rules, like a chess piece. A noun, for example, is simply a word that does nouny things. It's the kind of word that comes after an article, can have an S stuck onto it, and so on. There is a connection between concepts and part of speech categories, but it is a subtle and abstract one. When we construe an aspect of the world as something that can be identified and counted or measured, and that can play a role in events, language often allows us to express that aspect as a noun, whether or not it is a physical object. For example, when we say, I have 3 reasons for leaving, we're counting reasons as if they were objects, though of course we do not literally think that a reason can sit on a table or be kicked across a room. Similarly, when we construe some aspect of the world as an event or state involving several participants that affect one another, language often allows us to express that aspect as a verb. For example, when we say, "The situation justified drastic measures," we're talking about justification as if it was something the situation did, though again we know that justification is not something we can watch happening at a particular time and place. Nouns are often used for names of things and verbs for something being done, but because the human mind can construe reality in a variety of ways, nouns and verbs are not limited to those uses. Now, what about the phrases that group words into branches? One of the most intriguing discoveries of modern linguistics is that there appears to be a common anatomy to all phrases in all the world's languages. Take the English noun phrase. A noun phrase is named after one special word, a noun, that must be inside it. The noun phrase owes most of its properties to that one noun. For example, the noun phrase, "The cat in the hat," refers to a kind of cat, not a kind of hat. The meaning of the word cat is the core of the meaning of the whole phrase. Similarly, the phrase, "fox in socks," refers to a fox, not socks, and the entire phrase is singular in number. That is, we say that the fox in socks is or was here, not are or were here, because the word fox is singular in number. This special noun is called the head of the phrase, and the information filed with that word in memory percolates up to the topmost node where it is interpreted as characterizing the phrase as a whole. The same goes for verb phrases. "Flying to Rio before the police catch him" is an example of flying, not an example of catching, so the verb flying is called its head. Here we have the first principle of building the meaning of a phrase out of the meaning of the words inside the phrase. What the entire phrase is about is what its head word is about. The second principle allows phrases to refer not just to single things or actions in the world, but to sets of players that interact with each other in a particular way, each with a specific role. For example, the sentence, "Sergei gave the documents to the spy," is not just about any old act of giving. It choreographs three entities: Sergei, the giver; documents, the gift; and a spy, the recipient. These role players are usually called arguments, which has nothing to do with bickering. It's the term used in logic and mathematics for a participant in a relationship. A noun phrase, too, can assign roles to one or more players, as in "Picture of John, Governor of California," and "Sex with Dick Cavett," each defining one role. The head and its role players, other than the subject role, which is special, are joined together in a subphrase, smaller than a noun phrase or verb phrase, that has the kind of non-mnemonic label that has made generative linguistics so uninviting: noun bar and verb bar. The third ingredient of a phrase is one or more modifiers, usually called adjuncts. A modifier is different from a role player. Take the phrase, "the man from Illinois." Being a man from Illinois is not like being a governor of California. To be a governor, you have to be a governor of something. The Californianess plays a role in what it means for someone to be governor of California. In contrast, from Illinois is just a bit of information that we add on to help identify which man we're talking about. Being from one state or another is not an inherent part of what it means to be a man. This distinction in meaning between role players and modifiers, arguments and adjuncts in lingo, dictates the geometry of the phrase structure tree. The role player stays next to the head noun inside the noun bar, but the modifier goes upstairs, though still inside the noun phrase house. This restriction on the geometry of phrase structure trees is not just playing with notation. It is a hypothesis about how the rules of language are set up in our brains, governing the way we talk. It dictates that if a phrase contains both a role player and a modifier, the role player has to be closer to the head than the modifier is. There's no way the modifier could get between the head noun and the role player without crossing branches in the tree. That is, sticking extraneous words in among the bits of the noun bar, which is illegal. Consider Ronald Reagan. He used to be the governor of California, but he was born in Tampico, Illinois. When he was in office, he could have been referred to as the governor of California from Illinois. Role player, then modifier. It would have sounded odd to refer to him as the governor from Illinois of California. Modifier, then role player. More pointedly, in 1964, Robert F. Kennedy's senatorial ambitions ran up against the inconvenient fact that both Massachusetts seats were already occupied. So he simply took up residence in New York and ran for the U.S. Senate from there, soon becoming the senator from New York from Massachusetts, not the senator from Massachusetts from New York. Interestingly, what is true of noun bars and noun phrases is true of verb bars and verb phrases. Say that Sergei gave those documents to the spy in a hotel. The phrase, to the spy, is one of the role players of the verb give. There is no such thing as giving without a getter. Therefore, to the spy lives with the head verb inside the verb bar. But in a hotel is a modifier, a comment, an afterthought, and is kept outside the verb bar in the verb phrase. Thus, the phrases are inherently ordered. We can say, gave the documents to the spy in a hotel, but not gave in a hotel the documents to the spy. When a head is accompanied by just one phrase, however, that phrase can be either a role player, inside the verb bar, or a modifier, outside the verb bar but inside the verb phrase. And the actual order of the words is the same. Consider the following newspaper report. One witness told the commissioners that she had seen sexual intercourse taking place between two parked cars in front of her house. The aggrieved woman had a modifier interpretation in mind for between two parked cars, but twisted readers give it a role player interpretation. The fourth and final component of a phrase is a special position reserved for subjects, which linguists call spec, short for specifier, don't ask. The subject is a special role player, usually the causal agent, if there is one. For example, in the verb phrase, the guitarists destroy the hotel room, the phrase, the guitarists, is the subject. It is the causal agent of the event consisting of the hotel room being destroyed. Actually, noun phrases can have subjects too, as in the parallel noun phrase, the guitarist's destruction of the hotel room. Now the story begins to get interesting. You must have noticed that noun phrases and verb phrases have a lot in common. 1, a head, which gives the phrase its name and determines what it is about. 2, some role players which are grouped with the head inside a subphrase, the noun bar or verb bar. 3, modifiers which appear outside the noun or verb bar. 4, a subject. The orderings inside a noun phrase and inside a verb phrase are the same. The noun comes before its role players. The destruction of the hotel room, not the of the hotel room destruction. And the verb comes before its role players. To destroy the hotel room, not to the hotel room destroy. The modifiers go to the right, in both cases, the subject to the left. It seems as if there is a standard design to the two phrases. In fact, the design pops up all over the place. Take, for example, the prepositional phrase, in the hotel. It has a head, the preposition in, which means something like interior region, and then a role, the thing whose interior region is being picked out, in this case a hotel. And the same goes for the adjective phrase, in afraid of the wolf, The head adjective, afraid, occurs before its role player, the source of the fear. With this common design, there is no need to write out a long list of rules to capture what is inside a speaker's head. There may be just one pair of super rules for the entire language where the distinctions among nouns, verbs, prepositions and adjectives are collapsed, and all four are specified with a variable like x. Since a phrase just inherits the properties of its head, a tall man is a kind of man, it's redundant to call a phrase headed by a noun phrase. We could just call it an X phrase. Since the nounhood of the head noun, like the manhood of the head noun and all the other information in the head noun, percolates up to characterize the whole phrase. Here is what the super rules look like. A phrase consists of an optional subject followed by an X bar, followed by any number of modifiers. An X bar consists of a head word followed by any number of role players. Just plug in noun, verb, adjective or preposition, and you have the actual phrase structure rules that spell the phrases. This streamlined version of phrase structure is called the X-bar theory. This general blueprint for phrases extends even farther to other languages. In English, the head of a phrase comes before its role players. In many languages, it's the other way round. But it's the other way round across the board, across all the kinds of phrases in the language. For example, in Japanese, the verb comes after its object, not before. They say, kenji sushi et, not kenji et sushi. The preposition comes after its noun phrase, kenji to, not to kenji, so they're actually called postpositions. The adjective comes after its complement, kenji than taller, not taller than kenji. Even the words marking questions are flipped. They say roughly, kenji eat did, not did kenji eat. Japanese and English are looking-glass versions of each other, and such consistency has been found in scores of languages. If a language has the verb before the object, as in English, it will also have prepositions. If it has the verb after the object, as in Japanese, it will have postpositions. This is a remarkable discovery. It means that the super rules suffice not only for all phrases in English, but for all phrases in all languages, with one modification, removing the left to right order from each super rule. The trees become mobiles. One of the rules would say, an X bar is composed of a head X and any number of role players in either order. To get English, one appends a single bit of information saying that the order within an X bar is head first. To get Japanese, that bit of information would say that the order is head last. Similarly, the other super rule, the one for phrases, can be distilled so that left to right order boils away, and an ordered phrase in a particular language can be reconstituted by adding back either X bar first or X bar last. The piece of information that makes one language different from another is called a parameter. In fact, the super rule is beginning to look less like an exact blueprint for a particular phrase and more like a general guideline or principle for what phrases must look like. The principle is usable only after you combine it with a language's particular setting for the order parameter. This general conception of grammar, first proposed by Chomsky, is called the principles and parameters theory. Chomsky suggests that the unordered super rules, principles, are universal and innate, and that when children learn a particular language, they do not have to learn a long list of rules because they were born knowing the super rules. All they have to learn is whether their particular language has the parameter value head first, as in English, or head last, as in Japanese. They can do that merely by noticing whether a verb comes before or after its object in any sentence in their parent's speech. If the verb comes before the object, as in, eat your spinach, the child concludes that the language is head first. If it comes after, as in, your spinach eat, the child concludes that the language is head last. Huge chunks of grammar are then available to the child all at once, as if the child were merely flipping a switch to one of two possible positions. If this theory of language learning is true, it would help solve the mystery of how children's grammar explodes into adult-like complexity in so short a time. They're not acquiring dozens or hundreds of rules. They are just setting a few mental switches. The principles and parameters of phrase structure specify only what kinds of ingredients may go into a phrase, in what order. They do not spell out any particular phrase. Left to themselves, they would run amok and produce all kinds of mischief. Consider the following sentences which all conform to the principles or super-rules. Melvin dined. Melvin dined the pizza. Melvin devoured the pizza. Melvin devoured. Melvin put the car in the garage. Melvin put. Melvin put the car. Melvin put in the garage. Sheila alleged that Bill is a liar. Sheila alleged the claim. Sheila alleged. It must be the verb's fault. Some verbs, like dine, refuse to appear in the company of a direct object-noun phrase. Others, like devour, won't appear without one. This is true even though dine and devour are very close in meaning, both being ways of eating. You may recall from grammar lessons that verbs like dine are called intransitive, and verbs like devour are called transitive. But verbs come in many flavors, not just these two. The verb put is not content unless it has both an object-noun phrase, the car, and a prepositional phrase, in the garage. The verb allege requires an embedded sentence, that Bill is a liar, and nothing else. Within a phrase, then, the verb is a little despot, dictating which of the slots made available by the super-rules are to be filled. These demands are stored in the verb's entry in the mental dictionary, more or less as follows. Dine. Verb means to eat a meal in a refined setting. Eater equals subject. Devour. Verb means to eat something ravenously. Eater equals subject. Thing eaten equals object. Put. Verb means to cause something to go to some place. Putter equals subject. Thing put equals object. Place equals prepositional object. Allege. Verb means to declare without proof. Declarer equals subject. Declaration equals complement sentence. Each of these entries lists a definition, in mentalese, of some kind of event, followed by the players that have roles in the event. The entry indicates how each role player may be plugged into the sentence as a subject, an object, a prepositional object, an embedded sentence, and so on. For a sentence to feel grammatical, the verb's demands must be satisfied. Melvin devoured is bad because devour's desire for a thing eaten role is left unfulfilled. Melvin dined the pizza is bad because dine didn't order pizza or any other object. Because verbs have the power to dictate how a sentence conveys who did what to whom, one cannot sort out the roles in a sentence without looking up the verb. That is why your grammar teacher got it wrong when she told you that the subject of the sentence is the doer of the action. The subject of the sentence is often the doer, but only when the verb says so. The verb can also assign it other roles. The big bad wolf frightened the three little pigs. The subject is doing the frightening. The 3 little pigs feared the big bad wolf. The subject is being frightened. My true love gave me a partridge in a pear tree. The subject is doing the giving. I received a partridge in a pear tree from my true love. The subject is being given to. Dr. Nussbaum performed plastic surgery. The subject is operating on someone. Cheryl underwent plastic surgery. The subject is being operated on. In fact, many verbs have 2 distinct entries, each casting a different set of rules. This can give rise to a common kind of ambiguity, as in the old joke, "Call me a taxi." "Okay, you're a taxi." So how do we actually distinguish man bites dog from dog bites man? The dictionary entry for bite says, the biter is the subject, the bitten thing is the object. But how do we find subjects and objects in the tree? Grammar puts little tags on the noun phrases that can be matched up with the roles laid out in a verb's dictionary entry. These tags are called cases. In many languages, cases appear as prefixes or suffixes on the nouns. For example, in Latin, the nouns for man and dog, homo and canis, change their endings depending on who is biting whom. Canis hominem mordet. Not news. Homo canem mordet. News. Julius Caesar knew who bit whom because the noun corresponding to the bitee appeared with em at the end. Thanks to case markers, verbs' dictionary entries can be relieved of the duty of keeping track of where their role players actually appear in the sentence. A verb need only indicate that, say, the doer is a subject. Whether the subject is in first or third or fourth position in the sentence is up to the rest of the grammar, and the interpretation is the same. Centuries ago, English, like Latin, had suffixes that marked case overtly. But the suffixes have all eroded, and now, though nouns appear physically unchanged no matter what role they play, they are tagged with silent cases. English speakers tag a noun phrase with a case by seeing what the noun is adjacent to, generally a verb or preposition. They use these case tags to match up each noun phrase with its verb-decreed role. The requirement that noun phrases must get case tags explains why certain sentences are impossible even though the super rules admit them. For example, a direct object role player has to come right after the verb, before any other role player. One says, "Tell Mary that John is coming," not "Tell that John a coming Mary." The reason is that the noun phrase Mary cannot just float around tagless, but must be case-marked by sitting adjacent to the verb. Curiously, while verbs and prepositions can mark case on their adjacent noun phrases, nouns and adjectives cannot. Governor California and afraid the wolf, though interpretable, are ungrammatical. English demands that the meaningless preposition of precede the noun, as in Governor of California and afraid of the wolf, for no reason other than to give it a case tag. The sentences we utter are kept under tight rein by verbs and prepositions. Phrases cannot just show up anywhere they feel like in the verb phrase, but must have a job description and be wearing an identity badge at all times. Thus, we cannot say things like, "Last night I slept bad dreams, a hangover, snoring, no pajamas, sheets were wrinkled," even though a listener could guess what that would mean. Now, what about the most important phrase of all, the sentence? If a noun phrase is a phrase built around a noun, and a verb phrase is a phrase built around a verb, what is a sentence built around? The critic Mary McCarthy once said of her rival Lillian Hellman, "Every word she writes is a lie, including and the." The insult relies on the fact that a sentence is the smallest thing that can be either true or false. A single word cannot be either. A sentence, then, must express some kind of meaning that does not clearly reside in its nouns and verbs, but that embraces the entire combination and turns it into a proposition that can be true or false. Take, for example, the optimistic sentence, "The Red Sox will win the World Series." The word will does not apply to the Red Sox alone, nor to the World Series alone, nor to winning alone. It applies to an entire concept, the Red Sox winning the World Series. That concept is timeless and therefore truthless. It can refer to some past glory, a hypothetical future one, even to the mere possibility bereft of any hope that it will ever happen. But the word will pins the concept down to temporal coordinates, namely the stretch of time subsequent to the moment the sentence is uttered. If I declare, "The Red Sox will win the World Series," I can be right or wrong. Probably wrong, alas. The word will is an example of an auxiliary, a word that expresses layers of meaning having to do with the truth of a proposition as the speaker conceives it. These layers also include negation, as in won't and doesn't, necessity, must, and possibility, might and can. Auxiliaries typically occur at the periphery of sentence trees, mirroring the fact that they assert something about the rest of the sentence taken as a whole. The auxiliary is the head of the sentence in exactly the same way that a noun is the head of the noun phrase. Since the auxiliary is also called inflection, we can call the sentence an inflection phrase, or auxiliary phrase. Its subject position is reserved for the subject of the entire sentence, reflecting the fact that a sentence is an assertion that some predicate, the verb phrase, is true of its subject. An auxiliary is an example of a function word, a different kind of word from nouns, verbs, and adjectives, the content words. Function words include articles, the, a, some, pronouns, he, she, the possessive marker '(s), meaningless prepositions like of, words that introduce complements like that and to, and conjunctions like and or. Function words are bits of crystallized grammar. They delineate larger phrases into which noun phrases and verb phrases and auxiliary phrases fit, thereby providing a scaffolding for the sentence. Accordingly, the mind treats function words differently from content words. People add new content words to the language all the time, like the noun facts. But the function words form a closed club that resists new members. That is why all the attempts to introduce gender-neutral pronouns like hesh have failed. Function words are the most reliable clues to the phrase structure of the sentence, and they also capture much of what makes one language grammatically different from another. Now that I've begun to dissect syntax in front of you, I hope your reaction is more favourable than Eliza Doolittle's or Jack Cade's. At the very least, I hope you're impressed at how syntax is a Darwinian organ of extreme perfection and complication. Syntax is complex, but the complexity is there for a reason. For our thoughts are surely even more complex, and we are limited by a mouth that can produce a single word at a time. Science has begun to crack the beautifully designed code that our brains use to convey complex thoughts as words and their orderings. The workings of syntax are important for another reason. Grammar offers a clear refutation of the empiricist doctrine that there is nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses. Cases, X-bars, and the other paraphernalia of syntax are colourless, odourless, and tasteless, but they, or something like them, must be a part of our unconscious mental life. This should not be surprising to a thoughtful computer scientist. There's no way one can write a halfway intelligent program without defining variables and data structures that do not directly correspond to anything in the input or output. For example, a graphics program that had to store an image of a triangle inside a circle would not store the actual keystrokes that the user typed to draw the shapes, because the same shapes could have been drawn in a different order, or with a different device, like a mouse or a light pen. Nor would it store the list of dots that have to be lit up to display the shapes on a video screen, because the user might later want to move the circle around and leave the triangle in place, or make the circle bigger or smaller, and one long list of dots would not allow the program to know which dots belong to the circle and which to the triangle. Instead, the shapes would be stored in some more abstract format, like the coordinates of a few defining points for each shape. A format that mirrors neither the inputs nor the outputs to the program, but that can be translated to and from them when the need arises. Grammar, a form of mental software, must have evolved under similar design specifications. Grammar is a protocol that has to interconnect the ear, the mouth, and the mind, three very different kinds of machine. It cannot be tailored to any of them, but must have an abstract logic of its own. The idea that the human mind is designed to use abstract variables and data structures used to be, and in some circles still is, a shocking and revolutionary claim because the structures have no direct counterpart in the child's experience. Some of the organization of grammar would have to be there from the start, part of the language learning mechanism that allows children to make sense out of the noises they hear from their parents. The details of syntax have figured prominently in the history of psychology because they are a case where complexity in the mind is not caused by learning. Learning is caused by complexity in the mind. And that was real news.